Chapter 16 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JimOCR. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 16. Taming the Colt. "What in the world is that boy doing?" said Mrs. Jo to herself, as she watched Dan running round the half-mile triangle as if for a wager. He was all alone, and seemed possessed by some strange desire to run himself into a fever, or break his neck, for after several rounds he tried leaping walls and turning somersaults up the avenue, and finally dropped down on the grass before the door as if exhausted. "Are you training for a race, Dan?" asked Mrs. Jo from the window where she sat. He looked up quickly, and stopped panting to answer with a laugh. "No, I'm only working off my steam." "Can't you find a cooler way of doing it? You will be ill if you tear about so in such warm weather," said Mrs. Jo, laughing also, as she threw him out a great palm leaf fan. "Can't help it. I must run somewhere," answered Dan, with such an odd expression in his restless eyes that Mrs. Jo was troubled, and asked quickly, "Is Plumfield getting too narrow for you?" "I wouldn't mind if it was a little bigger. I like it, though. Only the fact is the devil gets into me sometimes, and then I do want to bolt." The words seemed to come against his will, for he looked sorry the minute they were spoken, and seemed to think he deserved a reproof for his ingratitude. But Mrs. Jo understood the feeling, and though sorry to see it, she could not blame the boy for confessing it. She looked at him anxiously, seeing how tall and strong he had grown, how full of energy his face was, with its eager eyes and resolute mouth, and remembering the utter freedom he had known for years before, she felt how even the gentle restraint of this home would weigh upon him at times when the old lawless spirit stirred in him. "Yes," she said to herself, "my wild hawk needs a larger cage. And yet, if I let him go, I am afraid he will be lost. I must try and find some lure strong enough to keep him safe. I know all about it," she added aloud. "It is not the devil, as you call it, but the very natural desire of all young people for liberty. I used to feel just so, and once I really did think for a minute that I would bolt." "Why didn't you?" said Dan, coming to lean on the low window ledge with an evident desire to continue the subject. "I knew it was foolish, and love for my mother kept me at home." "I haven't got any mother," began Dan. "I thought you had now," said Mrs. Jo, gently stroking the rough hair off his hot forehead. "You are no end good to me, and I can't ever thank you enough. But it just isn't the same, is it?" And Dan looked up at her with a wistful, hungry look that went to her heart. "No, dear, it is not the same, and never can be. I think an own mother would have been a great deal to you. But as that cannot be, you must try to let me fill her place. I fear I have not done all I ought, or you would not want to leave me," she added sorrowfully. "Yes, you have!" cried Dan eagerly. "I don't want to go, and I won't go, if I can help it. But every now and then I feel as if I must burst out somehow. I want to run straight ahead somewhere, to smash something, or pitch into somebody. Don't know why, but I do, and that's all about it." Dan laughed as he spoke, but he meant what he said, for he knit his black brows and brought down his fist on the ledge with such force that Mrs. Jo's thimble flew off into the grass. He brought it back, and as she took it she held the big brown hand a minute, saying with a look that showed the words cost her something: "Well, Dan, run if you must, but don't run very far. And come back to me soon, for I want you very much." He was rather taken aback by this unexpected permission to play truant, and somehow it seemed to lessen his desire to go. He did not understand why, but Mrs. Jo did, and, knowing the natural perversity of the human mind, counted on it to help her now. She felt instinctively that the more the boy was restrained, the more he would fret against it. But leave him free, and the mere sense of liberty would content him, joined to the knowledge that his presence was dear to those whom he loved best. It was a little experiment, but it succeeded, for Dan stood silent a moment, unconsciously picking the fan to pieces and turning the matter over in his mind. He felt that she appealed to his heart and his honor, and owned that he understood it by saying presently, with a mixture of regret and resolution in his face: "I won't go yet awhile, and I'll give you fair warning before I bolt. That's fair, isn't it?" "Yes, we will let it stand so. Now I want to see if I can't find some way for you to work off your steam better than running about the place like a mad dog, spoiling my fans, or fighting with the boys. What can we invent?" And while Dan tried to repair the mischief he had done, Mrs. Jo racked her brain for some new device to keep her truant safe until he had learned to love his lessons better. "How would you like to be my expressman?" she said, as a sudden thought popped into her head. "Go into town and do the errands?" asked Dan, looking interested at once. "Yes. Franz is tired of it. Silas cannot be spared just now, and Mr. Bhaer has no time. Old Andy is a safe horse. You are a good driver, and know your way about the city as well as a postman. Suppose you try it, and see if it won't do most as well to drive away 2 or 3 times a week as to run away once a month." "I'd like it ever so much, only I must go alone and do it all myself. I don't want any of the other fellows bothering round," said Dan, taking to the new idea so kindly that he began to put on business airs already. "If Mr. Bhaer does not object, you shall have it all your own way. I suppose Emil will growl, but he cannot be trusted with horses, and you can. By the way, to morrow is market day, and I must make out my list. You had better see that the wagon is in order, and tell Silas to have the fruit and vegetables ready for Mother. You will have to be up early, and get back in time for school. Can you do that?" "I'm always an early bird, so I don't mind," and Dan slung on his jacket with dispatch. "The early bird got the worm this time, I'm sure," said Mrs. Jo merrily. "And a jolly good worm it is," answered Dan, as he went laughing away to put a new lash to the whip, wash the wagon, and order Silas about with all the importance of a young expressman. "Before he is tired of this, I will find something else and have it ready when the next restless fit comes on," said Mrs. Jo to herself, as she wrote her list with a deep sense of gratitude that all her boys were not Dan's. Mr. Bhaer did not entirely approve of the new plan, but agreed to give it a trial, which put Dan on his mettle and caused him to give up certain wild plans of his own, in which the new lash and the long hill were to have borne a part. He was up and away very early the next morning, heroically resisting the temptation to race with the milkman going into town. Once there, he did his errands carefully, to Mr. Bhaer's surprise and Mrs. Jo's great satisfaction. The Commodore did growl at Dan's promotion, but was pacified by a superior padlock to his new boathouse, and the thought that seamen were meant for higher honors than driving market wagons and doing family errands. So Dan filled his new office well and contentedly for weeks, and said no more about bolting. But one day Mr. Bear found him pummeling Jack, who was roaring for mercy under his knee. "Why, Dan, I thought you had given up fighting," he said as he went to the rescue. "We ain't fighting. We are only wrestling," answered Dan, leaving off reluctantly. "It looks very much like it, and feels like it, hey, Jack?" said Mr. Bear, as the defeated gentleman got upon his legs with difficulty. "Catch me wrestling with him again! He's 'most knocked my head off," snarled Jack, holding on to that portion of his frame as if it really was loose upon his shoulders. "The fact is, we began in fun, but when I got him down I couldn't help pounding him. Sorry I hurt you, old fellow," explained Dan, looking rather ashamed of himself. "I understand. The longing to pitch into somebody was so strong you couldn't resist. You are a sort of berserker, Dan, and something to tussle with is as necessary to you as music is to Nat," said Mr. Bear, who knew all about the conversation between the boy and Mrs. Jo. "Can't help it. So if you don't want to be pounded you'd better keep out of the way," answered Dan, with a warning look in his black eyes that made Jack sheer off in haste. "If you want something to wrestle with, I will give you a tougher specimen than Jack," said Mr. Bear, and leading the way to the woodyard, he pointed out certain roots of trees that had been grubbed up in the spring and had been lying there waiting to be split. "There, when you feel inclined to maltreat the boys, just come and work off your energies here, and I'll thank you for it." "So I will." And seizing the axe that lay near, Dan hauled out a tough root and went at it so vigorously that the chips flew far and wide, and Mr. Bear fled for his life. To his great amusement, Dan took him at his word, and was often seen wrestling with the ungainly knots, hat and jacket off, red face and wrathful eyes, for he got into royal rages over some of his adversaries, and swore at them under his breath till he had conquered them, when he exulted and marched off to the shed with an armful of gnarled oak wood in triumph. He blistered his hands, tired his back, and dulled the axe, but it did him good, and he got more comfort out of the ugly roots than any one dreamed, for with each blow he worked off some of the pent-up power that would otherwise have been expended in some less harmless way. "When this is gone, I really don't know what I shall do," said Mrs. Jo to herself, for no inspiration came, and she was at the end of her resources. But Dan found a new occupation for himself, and enjoyed it some time before any one discovered the cause of his contentment. A fine young horse of Mr. Lorry's was kept at Plumfield that summer, running loose in a large pasture across the brook. The boys were all interested in the handsome, spirited creature, and for a time were fond of watching him gallop and frisk with his plumy tail flying and his handsome head in the air. But they soon got tired of it and left Prince Charlie to himself. All but Dan. He never tired of looking at the horse, and seldom failed to visit him each day with a lump of sugar, a bit of bread, or an apple to make him welcome. Charlie was grateful, accepted his friendship, and the two loved one another as if they felt some tie between them, inexplicable but strong. In whatever part of the wide field he might be, Charlie always came at full speed when Dan whistled at the bars, and the boy was never happier than when the beautiful fleet creature put its head on his shoulder, looking up at him with fine eyes full of intelligent affection. "We understand one another without any palaver, don't we, old fellow?" Dan would say, proud of the horse's confidence, and so jealous of his regard that he told no one how well the friendship prospered, and never asked anybody but Teddy to accompany him on these daily visits. Mr. Lorry came now and then to see how Charlie got on, and spoke of having him broken to harness in the autumn. "He won't need much taming. He is such a gentle, fine tempered brute. I shall come out and try him with a saddle myself some day," he said on one of these visits. "He lets me put a halter on him, but I don't believe he will bear a saddle, even if you put it on," answered Dan, who never failed to be present when Charlie and his master met. "I shall coax him to bear it, and not mind a few tumbles at first. He has never been harshly treated, so, though he will be surprised at the new performance, I think he won't be frightened, and his antics will do no harm." "I wonder what he would do," said Dan to himself, as Mr. Lorry went away with the professor, and Charlie returned to the bars, from which he had retired when the gentleman came up. A daring fancy to try the experiment took possession of the boy as he sat on the topmost rail, with the glossy back temptingly near him. Never thinking of danger, he obeyed the impulse, and while Charlie unsuspectingly nibbled at the apple he held, Dan quickly and quietly took his seat. He did not keep it long, however, for with an astonished snort Charlie reared straight up and deposited Dan on the ground. The fall did not hurt him, for the turf was soft, and he jumped up, saying with a laugh, "I did it anyway. Come here, you rascal, and I'll try it again." But Charlie declined to approach, and Dan left him, resolving to succeed in the end, for a struggle like this suited him exactly. Next time he took a halter, and having got it on, he played with the horse for a while, leading him to and fro, and putting him through various antics till he was a little tired. Then Dan sat on the wall and gave him bread, but watched his chance, and getting a good grip of the halter, slipped on to his back. Charlie tried the old trick, but Dan held on, having had practice with Toby, who occasionally had an obstinate fit and tried to shake off his rider. Charlie was both amazed and indignant, and after prancing for a minute, set off at a gallop, and away went Dan heels over head. If he had not belonged to the class of boys who go through all sorts of dangers unscathed, he would have broken his neck. As it was, he got a heavy fall, and lay still collecting his wits, while Charlie tore round the field, tossing his head with every sign of satisfaction at the discomfiture of his rider. Presently it seemed to occur to him that something was wrong with Dan, and being of a magnanimous nature, he went to see what the matter was. Dan let him sniff about and perplex himself for a few minutes. Then he looked up at him, saying as decidedly as if the horse could understand, "You think you have beaten, but you are mistaken, old boy, and I'll ride you yet. See if I don't." He tried no more that day, but soon after attempted a new method of introducing Charlie to a burden. He strapped a folded blanket on his back, and then let him race and rear, and roll and fume as much as he liked. After a few fits of rebellion Charlie submitted, and in a few days permitted Dan to mount him, often stopped short to look round, as if he said, half patiently, half reproachfully, "I don't understand it, but I suppose you mean no harm, so I permit the liberty." Dan patted and praised him, and took a short turn every day, getting frequent falls, but persisting in spite of them, and longing to try a saddle and bridle, but not daring to confess what he had done. He had his wish, however, for there had been a witness of his pranks who said a good word for him. "Do you know what that chap has been doin' lately?" asked Silas of his master one evening as he received his orders for the next day. "Which boy?" said Mr. Bhaer, with an air of resignation, expecting some sad revelation. "Dan, he's been a breakin' the colt, sir, and I wish I may die if he ain't done it," answered Silas, chuckling. "How do you know?" "Well, I kinder keep an eye on the little fellers, and most generally know what they're up to. So when Dan kept goin' off to the pasture and coming home black and blue, I mistrusted that something was goin' on. I didn't say nothin', but I crept up into the barn chamber, and from there I see him going through all manner of games with Charley. Blest if he wa'n't throwed time and agin, and knocked round like a bag o' meal. But the pluck of that boy did beat all, and he 'peared to like it, and kept on as if bound to beat." "But, Silas, you should have stopped it. The boy might have been killed," said Mr. Bhaer, wondering what freak his irrepressibles would take into their heads next. "'Spose I oughter, but there warn't no real danger, for Charley ain't no tricks, and is as pretty a tempered horse as ever I see. Fact was, I couldn't bear to spile sport, for if there's anything I do admire it's grit, and Dan is chocked full on't. But now I know he's hankerin' after a saddle, and yet won't take even the old one on the sly. So I just thought I'd up and tell, and maybe you'd let him try what he can do. Mr. Lorry won't mind, and Charley's all the better for't." "We shall see," and off went Mr. Bhaer to inquire into the matter. Dan owned up at once, and proudly proved that Silas was right by showing off his power over Charley, for by dint of much coaxing, many carrots, and infinite perseverance, he really had succeeded in riding the colt with a halter and blanket. Mr. Lorry was much amused and well pleased with Dan's courage and skill, and let him have a hand in all future performances, for he set about Charley's education at once, saying that he was not going to be outdone by a slip of a boy. Thanks to Dan, Charley took kindly to the saddle and bridle when he had once reconciled himself to the indignity of the bit, and after Mr. Lorry had trained him a little, Dan was permitted to ride him, to the great envy and admiration of the other boys. "Isn't he handsome, and don't he mind me like a lamb?" said Dan one day, as he dismounted and stood with his arm round Charley's neck. "Yes, and isn't he a much more useful and agreeable animal than the wild colt who spent his days racing about the field, jumping fences, and running away now and then?" asked Mrs. Bhaer from the steps where she always appeared when Dan performed with Charley. "Of course he is. See, he won't run away now, even if I don't hold him, and he comes to me the minute I whistle. I have tamed him well, haven't I?" And Dan looked both proud and pleased, as well he might, for in spite of their struggles together, Charley loved him better than his master. "I am taming a colt too, and I think I shall succeed as well as you if I am as patient and persevering," said Mrs. Jo, smiling so significantly at him that Dan understood and answered, laughing, yet in earnest, "We won't jump over the fence and run away, but stay and let them make a handsome, useful span of us. Hey, Charley?" End of chapter 16. Recording by JimOCR. Randolph, Massachusetts, December 2010. Chapter 17 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JimOCR. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 17. Composition Day. "Hurry up, boys. It's 3 o'clock, and Uncle Fritz likes us to be punctual, you know," said Franz one Wednesday afternoon as a bell rang, and a stream of literary looking young gentlemen, with books and paper in their hands, were seen going toward the museum. Tommy was in the schoolroom, bending over his desk, much bedaubed with ink, flushed with the ardor of inspiration. and in a great hurry as usual, for easy-going Bangs never was ready till the very last minute. As Franz passed the door looking up laggards, Tommy gave one last blot and flourish, and departed out the window, waving his paper to dry as he went. Nan followed, looking very important, with a large roll in her hand, and Demi escorted Daisy, both evidently brimful of some delightful secret. The museum was all in order, and the sunshine among the hop vines made pretty shadows on the floor as it peeped through the great window. On one side sat Mr. and Mrs. Bhaer. On the other was a little table on which the compositions were laid as soon as read, and in a large semicircle sat the children on camp stools, which occasionally shut up and let the sitter down, thus preventing any stiffness in the assembly. As it took too much time to have all read, they took turns, and on this Wednesday the younger pupils were the chief performers, while the elder ones listened with condescension and criticized freely. "Ladies first, so Nan may begin," said Mr. Bhaer, when the settling of stools and rustling of papers had subsided. Nan took her place beside the little table, and with a preliminary giggle read the following interesting essay on "The Sponge." "The sponge, my friends, is a most useful and interesting plant. It grows on rocks under the water, and is a kind of seaweed. I believe people go and pick it, and dry it and wash it, because little fish and insects live in the holes of the sponge. I found shells in my new one, and sand. Some are very fine and soft. Babies are washed with them. The sponge has many uses. I will relate some of them, and I hope my friends will remember what I say. One use is to wash the face. I don't like it myself, but I do it because I wish to be clean. Some people don't, and they are dirty." Here the eye of the reader rested sternly upon Dick and Dolly, who quailed under it, and instantly resolved to scrub themselves virtuously on all occasions. "Another use is to wake people up. I allude to boys particularly." Another pause after the long word to enjoy the smothered laugh that went round the room. "Some boys do not get up when called, and Mary Ann squeezes the water out of a wet sponge on their faces, and it makes them so mad they wake up." Here the laugh broke out, and Emil said, as if he had been hit, "Seems to me you are wandering from the subject." "No, I ain't. We are to write about vegetables or animals, and I'm doing both, for boys are animals, aren't they?" cried Nan, and, undaunted by the indignant "No" shouted at her, she calmly proceeded. "One more interesting thing is done with sponges, and this is when doctors put ether on it and hold it to people's noses when they have teeth out. I shall do this when I am bigger, and give ether to the sick so they will go to sleep and not feel me cut off their legs and arms." "I know somebody who killed cats with it," called out Demi, but was promptly crushed by Dan, who upset his camp stool and put a hat over his face. "I will not be interrupted," said Nan, frowning upon the unseemly scrimmages. Order was instantly restored, and the young lady closed her remarks as follows: "My composition has 3 morals, my friends." Somebody groaned, but no notice was taken of the insult. "First is keep your faces clean. Second, get up early. Third, when the ether sponge is put over your nose, breathe hard and don't kick, and your teeth will come out easy. I have no more to say." And Miss Nan sat down amid tumultuous applause. "That is a very remarkable composition. Its tone is high, and there is a good deal of humor in it. Very well done, Nan. Now, Daisy," and Mr. Bhaer smiled at one young lady as he beckoned the other. Daisy colored prettily as she took her place, and said in her modest little voice, "I'm afraid you won't like mine. It isn't nice and funny like Nan's, but I couldn't do any better." "We always like yours, Posy," said Uncle Fritz, and a gentle murmur from the boys seemed to confirm the remark. Thus encouraged, Daisy read her little paper, which was listened to with respectful attention. The cat. "The cat is a sweet animal. I love them very much. They are clean and pretty, and catch rats and mice, and let you pet them, and are fond of you if you are kind. They are very wise, and can find their way anywhere. Little cats are called kittens, and are dear things. I have two, named Huz and Buzz, and their mother is Topaz, because she has yellow eyes. Uncle told me a pretty story about a man named Mahomet. He had a nice cat, and when she was asleep on his sleeve, and he wanted to go away, he cut off the sleeve so as not to wake her up. I think he was a kind man. Some cats catch fish." "So do I!" cried Teddy, jumping up eager to tell about his trout. "Hush!" said his mother, setting him down again as quickly as possible, for orderly Daisy hated to be interrupted, as Nan expressed it. "I read about one who used to do it very slyly. I tried to make Topaz, but she did not like the water and scratched me. She does like tea, and when I play in my kitchen she pats the teapot with her paw till I give her some. She is a fine cat. She eats apple pudding and molasses. Most cats do not." "That's a first-rater," called out Nat, and Daisy retired, pleased with the praise of her friend. "Demi looks so impatient we must have him up at once or he won't hold out," said Uncle Fritz, and Demi skipped up with alacrity. "Mine is a poem," he announced in a tone of triumph, and read his first effort in a loud and solemn voice. "I write about the butterfly. It is a pretty thing, and flies about like the birds, but it does not sing. First it is a little grub, and then it is a nice yellow cocoon, and then the butterfly eats its way out soon. They live on dew and honey. They do not have any hive. They do not sting like wasps and bees and hornets, and to be as good as they are we should strive. I should like to be a beautiful butterfly, all yellow and blue and green and red, but I should not like to have Dan put camphor on my poor little head." This unusual burst of genius brought down the house, and Demi was obliged to read it again, a somewhat difficult task, as there was no punctuation whatever, and the little poet's breath gave out before he got to the end of some of the long lines. "He will be a Shakespeare yet," said Aunt Jo, laughing as if she would die, for this poetic gem reminded her of one of her own, written at the age of 10, and beginning gloomily, "I wish I had a quiet tomb beside a little rill, where birds and bees and butterflies would sing upon the hill." "Come on, Tommy. If there's as much ink inside your paper as there is outside it will be a long composition," said Mr. Bhaer, when Demi had been induced to tear himself from his poem and sit down. "It isn't a composition. It's a letter. You see, I forgot all about its being my turn till after school, and then I didn't know what to have, and there wasn't time to read up, so I thought you wouldn't mind my taking a letter that I wrote to my grandma. It's got something about birds in it, so I thought it would do." With this long excuse Tommy plunged into a sea of ink and floundered through, pausing now and then to decipher one of his own flourishes. "My dear Grandma, I hope you are well. Uncle James sent me a pocket rifle. It is a beautiful little instrument of killing, shaped like this." Here Tommy displayed a remarkable sketch of what looked like an intricate pump, or the inside of a small steam engine. 44 are the sights, 6 is a false stock that fits in at A. 3 is the trigger, and 2 is the cock. It loads at the breech and fires with great force and straightness. I am going out shooting squirrels soon. I shot several fine birds for the museum. They had speckled breasts, and Dan liked them very much. He stuffed them tip-top, and they sit on the tree quite natural, only one looks a little tipsy. We had a Frenchman working here the other day, and Asia called his name so funnily that I will tell you about it. His name was Germain. First she called him Jerry, but we laughed at her, and she changed it to Jeremiah, but ridicule was the result, so it became Mr. Germany. But ridicule having been again resumed, it became Garrimon, which it has remained ever since. I do not write often, I am so busy, but I think of you often and sympathize with you, and sincerely hope you get on as well as can be expected without me. Your affectionate grandson, Thomas Buckminster Bangs. Postscript. If you come across any postage stamps, remember me. Nota bene. Love to all, and a great deal to Aunt Almira. Does she make any nice plum cakes now? P.S. Mrs. Bhaer sends her respects. P.S. And so would Mr. B. if he knew I was in act to write. Nota bene. Father is going to give me a watch on my birthday. I am glad, as at present I have no means of telling time, and am often late at school. P.S. I hope to see you soon. Don't you wish to send for me? T.B.B. As each postscript was received with a fresh laugh from the boys, by the time he came to the 6th and last, Tommy was so exhausted that he was glad to sit down and wipe his ruddy face. "I hope the dear old lady will live through it," said Mr. Bhaer under cover of the noise. "We won't take any notice of the broad hint given in that last P.S. The letter will be quite as much as she can bear without a visit from Tommy," answered Mrs. Jo, remembering that the old lady usually took to her bed after a visitation from her irrepressible grandson. "Now me," said Teddy, who had learned a bit of poetry, and was so eager to say it that he had been bobbing up and down during the reading, and could no longer be restrained. "I'm afraid he will forget it if he waits, and I have had a deal of trouble teaching him," said his mother. Teddy trotted to the rostrum, dropped a curtsy, and nodded his head at the same time, as if anxious to suit every one. Then in his baby voice, and putting the emphasis on the wrong words, he said his verse all in one breath: "Little drops of water, little drains of sand, made a mite ocean and a peasant land. Little words of kindness, spoken every day, make a home a heaven and help us on our way." Clapping his hands at the end, he made another double salutation, and then ran to hide his head in his mother's lap, quite overcome by the success of his piece, for the applause was tremendous. Dick and Dolly did not write, but were encouraged to observe the habits of animals and insects and report what they saw. Dick liked this and always had a great deal to say, so when his name was called he marched up, and, looking at the audience with his bright, confiding eyes, told his little story so earnestly that no one smiled at his crooked body, because the straight soul shone through it beautifully. "I've been watching dragon flies, and I read about them in Dan's book, and I'll try and tell you what I remember. There's lots of them flying round on the pond, all blue with big eyes and sort of lace wings, very pretty. I caught one and looked at him, and I think he was the handsomest insect I ever saw. They catch littler creatures than they are to eat, and have a queer kind of hook thing that folds up when they ain't hunting. It likes the sunshine and dances round all day. Let me see, what else was there to tell about? Oh, I know! The eggs are laid in the water and go down to the bottom and are hatched in the mud. Little ugly things come out of 'em. I can't say the name, but they are brown, and keep having new skins and getting bigger and bigger. Only think, it takes them 2 years to be a dragon fly. Now this is the curiousest part of it, so you listen tight, for I don't believe you know it. When it is ready, it knows somehow, and the ugly, grubby thing climbs up out of the water on a flag or a bulrush, and bursts open its back." "Come, I don't believe that," said Tommy, who was not an observant boy, and really thought Dick was "making up." "It does burst open its back, don't it?" and Dick appealed to Mr. Bhaer, who nodded a very decided affirmative, to the little speaker's great satisfaction. "Well, out comes the dragon fly all whole, and he sits in the sun sort of coming alive, you know, and he gets strong, and then he spreads his pretty wings and flies away up in the air, and never is a grub any more. That's all I know, but I shall watch and try to see him do it, for I think it's splendid to turn into a beautiful dragon fly, don't you?" Dick had told his story well, and when he described the flight of the new-born insect had waved his hands, and looked up as if he saw and wanted to follow it. Something in his face suggested to the minds of the elder listeners the thought that some day little Dick would have his wish, and after years of helplessness and pain would climb up into the sun some happy day, and, leaving his poor little body behind him, find a new lovely shape in a fairer world than this. Mrs. Jo drew him to her side and said with a kiss on his thin cheek: "That is a sweet little story, dear, and you remembered it wonderfully well. I shall write and tell your mother all about it." And Dick sat on her knee, contentedly smiling at the praise, and resolving to watch well and catch the dragon fly in the act of leaving its old body for the new, and see how he did it. Dolly had a few remarks to make upon the duck, and made them in a sing-song tone, for he had learned it by heart, and thought it a great plague to do it at all. "While ducks are hard to kill, men hide and shoot at them, and have tame ducks to quack, and make the wild ones come where the men can fire at them. They have wooden ducks made too, and they sail round, and the wild ones come to see them. They are stupid, I think. Our ducks are very tame. They eat a great deal, and go poking round in the mud and water. They don't take good care of their eggs, but them spoil, and—" "Mine don't!" cried Tommy. "Well, some people's do. Silas said so. Hens take good care of little ducks, only they don't like to have them go in the water and make a great fuss. But the little ones don't care a bit. I like to eat ducks with stuffing in them and lots of apple sauce." "I have something to say about owls," began Nat, who had carefully prepared a paper upon this subject with some help from Dan. "Owls have big heads, round eyes, hooked bills, and strong claws. Some are gray, some white, some black and yellowish. Their feathers are very soft and stick out a great deal. They fly very quietly and hunt bats, mice, little birds, and such things. They build nests in barns, hollow trees, and some take the nests of other birds. The great horned owl has 2 eggs bigger than a hen's and reddish brown. The tawny owl has 5 eggs, white and smooth, and this is the kind that hoots at night. Another kind sounds like a child crying. They eat mice and bats whole, and the parts that they cannot digest they make into little balls and spit out." "My gracious, how funny!" Nan was heard to observe. "They cannot see by day, and if they get out into the light they go flapping round half blind, and the other birds chase and peck at them as if they were making fun. The horned owl is very big, most as big as the eagle. It eats rabbits, rats, snakes, and birds, and lives in rocks and old tumble-down houses. They have a good many cries, and scream like a person being choked, and say, "Wah-oh! Wah-oh!" and it scares people at night in the woods. The white owl lives by the sea and in cold places, and looks something like a hawk. There is a kind of owl that makes holes to live in like moles. It is called the burrowing owl, and is very small. The barn owl is the commonest kind, and I have watched one sitting in a hole in a tree, looking like a little gray cat, with one eye shut and the other open. He comes out at dusk and sits round waiting for the bats. I caught one, and here he is." With that Nat suddenly produced from inside his jacket a little downy bird, who blinked and ruffled his feathers, looking very plump and sleepy and scared. "Don't touch him. He is going to show off," said Nat, displaying his new pet with great pride. First he put a cocked hat on the bird's head, and the boys laughed at the funny effect. Then he added a pair of paper spectacles, and that gave the owl such a wise look that they shouted with merriment. The performance closed with making the bird angry and seeing him cling to a handkerchief upside down, pecking and clucking, as Rob called it. He was allowed to fly after that, and settled himself on the bunch of pine cones over the door, where he sat staring down at the company with an air of sleepy dignity that amused them very much. "Have you anything for us, George?" asked Mr. Bhaer when the room was still again. "Well, I read and learned ever so much about moles, but I declare I've forgotten every bit of it, except that they dig holes to live in, that you catch them by pouring water down, and that they can't possibly live without eating very often." And Stuffy sat down, wishing he had not been too lazy to write out his valuable observations, for a general smile went round when he mentioned the last of the three facts which lingered in his memory. "Then we are done for to day," began Mr. Bhaer, but Tommy called out in a great hurry, "No, we ain't! Don't you know we must give the thing?" and he winked violently as he made an eyeglass of his fingers. "Bless my heart, I forgot! Now is your time, Tom," and Mr. Bhaer dropped into his seat again, while all the boys but Dan looked mightily tickled at something. Nat, Tommy, and Demi left the room, and speedily returned with a little red morocco box set forth in state on Mrs. Joe's best silver salver. Tommy bore it, and, still escorted by Nat and Demi, marched up to unsuspecting Dan, who stared at them as if he thought they were going to make fun of him. Tommy had prepared an elegant and impressive speech for the occasion, but when the minute came, it all went out of his head, and he just said straight from his kindly, boyish heart: "Here, old fellow, we all wanted to give you something to kind of pay for what happened a while ago, and to show how much we liked you for being such a trump. Please take it, and have a jolly good time with it." Dan was so surprised that he could only get as red as the little box, and mutter, "Thanky, boys," as he fumbled to open it. But when he saw what was inside, his face lighted up, and he seized the long desired treasure, saying so enthusiastically that every one was satisfied, though his language was anything but polished: "What a stunner! I say, you fellows are regular bricks to give me this. It's just what I wanted. Give us your paw, Tommy." Many paws were given and heartily shaken, for the boys were charmed with Dan's pleasure, and crowded round him to shake hands and expatiate on the beauties of their gift. In the midst of this pleasant chatter Dan's eye went to Mrs. Joe, who stood outside the group enjoying the scene with all her heart. "No, I had nothing to do with it. The boys got it all up themselves," she said, answering the grateful look that seemed to thank her for that happy moment. Dan smiled and said in a tone that only she could understand, "It's you all the same," and making his way through the boys he held out his hand first to her and then to the good professor, who was beaming benevolently on his flock. He thanked them both with the silent, hearty squeeze he gave the kind hands that had held him up, and led him into the safe refuge of a happy home. Not a word was spoken, but they felt all he would say, and little Teddy expressed his pleasure for them as he leaned from his father's arm to hug the boy and say in his baby way, "My good Danny, everybody loves him now. Come here, show off your spyglass, Dan, and let us see some of your magnified pollywogs, and animalcumisms, as you call 'em," said Jack, who felt so uncomfortable during this scene that he would have slipped away if Emil had not kept him. "So I will. Take a squint at that and see what you think of it," said Dan, glad to show off his precious microscope. He held it over a beetle that happened to be lying on the table, and Jack bent down to take a squint, but looked up with an amazed face, saying, "My eye! What nippers the old thing has got! I see now why it hurts so confoundedly when you grab a doorbug and he grabs back again." "He winked at me!" cried Nan, who had poked her head under Jack's elbow and got the second peep. Every one took a look, and then Dan showed them the lovely plumage on a moth's wing, the 4 feathery corners to a hair, the veins on a leaf hardly visible to the naked eye, but like a thick net through the wonderful little glass, the skin on their own fingers, looking like queer hills and valleys, a cobweb like a bit of coarse sewing silk, and the sting of a bee. "It's like the fairy spectacles in my story book, only more curious," said Demi, enchanted with the wonders he saw. "Dan is a magician now, and he can show you many miracles going on all round you, for he has 2 things, needful patience and a love of nature. We live in a beautiful and wonderful world, Demi, and the more you know about it the wiser and the better you will be. This little glass will give you a new set of teachers, and you may learn fine lessons from them if you will," said Mr. Bear, glad to see how interested the boys were in the matter. "Could I see anybody's soul with this microscope if I looked hard?" asked Demi, who was much impressed with the power of the bit of glass. "No, dear, it's not powerful enough for that, and never can be made so. You must wait a long while before your eyes are clear enough to see the most invisible of God's wonders. But looking at the lovely things you can see will help you to understand the lovelier things you cannot see," answered Uncle Fritz, with his hand on the boy's head. "Well, Daisy and I both think that if there are any angels, their wings look like that butterfly's as we see it through the glass, only more soft and gold. Believe it if you like, and keep your own little wings as bright and beautiful, only don't fly away for a long time yet." "No, I won't," and Demi kept his word. "Good bye, my boys. I must go now, but I leave you with our new professor of natural history," and Mrs. Joe went away well pleased with that composition day. End of chapter 17. Recording by James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts, December 2010.
Chapter 18 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 18. Crops. The gardens did well that summer, and in September the little crops were gathered in with much rejoicing. Jack and Ned joined their farms and raised potatoes, those being a good saleable article. They got 12 bushels, counting little ones and all, and sold them to Mr. Bear at a fair price, for potatoes went fast in that house. Emil and Franz devoted themselves to corn, and had a jolly little husking in the barn, after which they took their corn to the mill and came proudly home with meal enough to supply the family with hasty pudding and johnny cake for a long time. They would not take money for their crop because, as Franz said, "We never can pay Uncle for all he has done for us if we raised corn for the rest of our days." Nat had beans in such abundance that he despaired of ever shelling them, till Mrs. Joe proposed a new way which succeeded admirably. The dry pods were spread upon the barn floor, Nat fiddled, and the boys danced quadrilles on them, till they were thrashed out with much merriment and very little labor. Tommy's 6 weeks' beans were a failure, for a dry spell early in the season hurt them because he gave them no water, and after that he was so sure that they could take care of themselves he let the poor things struggle with bugs and weeds till they were exhausted and died a lingering death. So Tommy had to dig his farm over again and plant peas. But they were late, the birds ate many, the bushes not being firmly planted blew down, and when the poor peas came at last no one cared for them as their day was over, and spring lamb had grown into mutton. Tommy consoled himself with a charitable effort, for he transplanted all the thistles he could find, and tended them carefully for Toby, who was fond of the prickly delicacy, and had eaten all he could find on the place. The boys had great fun over Tom's thistle bed, but he insisted that it was better to care for poor Toby than for himself, and declared that he would devote his entire farm next year to thistles, worms, and snails, that Demi's turtles and Nat's pet owl might have the food they loved as well as the donkey. So like shiftless, kind-hearted, happy-go-lucky Tommy. Demi had supplied his grandmother with lettuce all summer, and in the autumn sent his grandfather a basket of turnips, each one scrubbed up till it looked like a great white egg. His grandma was fond of salad, and one of his grandpa's favorite quotations was, "Lucullus, whom frugality could charm, ate roasted turnips at the Sabine farm." Therefore these vegetable offerings to the dear domestic god and goddess were affectionate, appropriate, and classical. Daisy had nothing but flowers in her little plot, and it bloomed all summer long with a succession of gay or fragrant posies. She was very fond of her garden, and delved away in it at all hours, watching over her roses and pansies, sweet peas and mignonette, as faithfully and tenderly as she did over her dolls or her friends. Little nosegays were sent into town on all occasions, and certain vases about the house were her especial care. She had all sorts of pretty fancies about her flowers, and loved to tell the children the story of the pansy, and show them how the stepmother leaf sat up in her green chair in purple and gold, how the 2 own children in gay yellow had each its little seat, while the stepchildren in dull colors both sat on one small stool, and the poor little father in his red nightcap was kept out of sight in the middle of the flower. That a monk's dark face looked out of the monk's hood larkspur, that the flowers of the canary vine were so like dainty birds fluttering their yellow wings that one almost expected to see them fly away, and the snapdragons that went off like little pistol shots when you cracked them. Splendid dollies did she make out of scarlet and white poppies, with ruffled robes tied round the waist with grass-blade sashes, and astonishing hats of coreopsis on their green heads. Pea-pod boats with rose-leaf sails received these flower people, and floated them about a placid pool in the most charming style, for finding that there were no elves, Daisy made her own, and loved the fanciful little friends who played their parts in her summer life. Nan went in for herbs, and had a fine display of useful plants, which she tended with steadily increasing interest and care. Very busy was she in September, cutting, drying, and tying up her sweet harvest, and writing down in a little book how the different herbs are to be used. She had tried several experiments, and made several mistakes, so she wished to be particular, lest she should give little Huz another fit by administering wormwood instead of catnip. Dick, Dolly, and Rob each grubbed away on his small farm, and made more stir about it than all the rest put together. Parsnips and carrots were the crops of the 2 Ds, and they longed for it to be late enough to pull up the precious vegetables. Dick did privately examine his carrots and plant them again, feeling that Silas was right in saying it was too soon for them yet. Rob's crop was 4 small squashes and 1 immense pumpkin. It really was a bouncer, as everyone said, and I assure you that 2 small persons could sit on it side by side. It seemed to have absorbed all the goodness of the little garden, and all the sunshine that shone down on it, and lay there a great round golden ball, full of rich suggestions of pumpkin pies for weeks to come. Robbie was so proud of his mammoth vegetable that he took everyone to see it, and when frosts began to nip, covered it up each night with an old bedquilt, tucking it round as if the pumpkin was a well-beloved baby. The day it was gathered he would let no one touch it but himself, and nearly broke his back tugging it to the barn in his little wheelbarrow, with Dick and Dolly harnessed in front to give him a heave up the path. His mother promised him that the Thanksgiving pies should be made from it, and hinted vaguely that she had a plan in her head which would cover the prize pumpkin and its owner with glory. Poor Billy had planted cucumbers, but unfortunately hoed them up and left the pigweed. This mistake grieved him very much for 10 minutes, then he forgot all about it, and sewed a handful of bright buttons which he had collected, evidently thinking in his feeble mind that they were money, and would come up and multiply so that he might make many quarters as Tommy did. No one disturbed him, and he did what he liked with his plot, which soon looked as if a series of small earthquakes had stirred it up. When the general harvest day came, he would have had nothing but stones and weeds to show, if kind old Asia had not hung 6 oranges on the dead tree he stuck up in the middle. Billy was delighted with his crop, and no one spoiled his pleasure in the little miracle which pity wrought for him by making withered branches bear strange fruit. Stuffy had various trials with his melons, for, being impatient to taste them, he had a solitary revel before they were ripe, and made himself so ill that for a day or two it seemed doubtful if he would ever eat any more. But he pulled through it, and served up his first cantaloupe without tasting a mouthful himself. They were excellent melons, for he had a warm slope for them, and they ripened fast. The last and best were lingering on the vines, and Stuffy had announced that he should sell them to a neighbor. This disappointed the boys, who had hoped to eat the melons themselves, and they expressed their displeasure in a new and striking manner. Going one morning to gaze upon the 3 fine watermelons which he had kept for market, Stuffy was horrified to find the word "pig" cut in white letters on the green rind, staring at him from every one. He was in a great rage, and flew to Mrs. Jo for redress. She listened, condoled with him, and then said, "If you want to turn the laugh, I'll tell you how, but you must give up the melons." "Well, I will, for I can't thrash all the boys, but I'd like to give them something to remember, the mean sneaks," growled Stuffy, still in a fume. Now Mrs. Jo was pretty sure who had done the trick, for she had seen 3 heads suspiciously near to one another in the sofa corner the evening before, and when these heads had nodded with chuckles and whispers, this experienced woman knew mischief was afoot. A moonlight night, a rustling in the old cherry tree near Emil's window, a cut on Tommy's finger, all helped to confirm her suspicions, and having cooled Stuffy's wrath a little, she bade him bring his maltreated melons to her room, and not say a word to any one of what had happened. He did so, and the 3 wags were amazed to find their joke so quietly taken. It spoiled the fun, and the entire disappearance of the melons made them uneasy. So did Stuffy's good nature, for he looked more placid and plump than ever, and surveyed them with an air of calm pity that perplexed them very much. At dinner time they discovered why, for then Stuffy's vengeance fell upon them, and the laugh was turned against them. When the pudding was eaten and the fruit was put on, Mary Ann reappeared in a high state of giggle, bearing a large watermelon. Silas followed with another, and Dan brought up the rear with a third. One was placed before each of the 3 guilty lads, and they read on the smooth green skins this addition to their own work, "With the compliments of the pig." Everyone else read it also, and the whole table was in a roar, for the trick had been whispered about, so everyone understood the sequel. Emil, Ned, and Tommy did not know where to look, and had not a word to say for themselves, so they wisely joined in the laugh, cut up the melons, and handed them round, saying what all the rest agreed to, that Stuffy had taken a wise and merry way to return good for evil. Dan had no garden, for he was away or lame the greater part of the summer, so he had helped Silas wherever he could, chopped wood for Asia, and taking care of the lawn so well that Mrs. Jo always had smooth paths and nicely shaven turf before her door. When the others got in their crops, he looked sorry that he had so little to show, but as autumn went on, he bethought himself of a woodland harvest which no one would dispute with him, and which was peculiarly his own. Every Saturday he was away alone to the forests, fields, and hills, and always came back loaded with spoils, for he seemed to know the meadows where the best flagroot grew, the thicket where the sassafras was spiciest, the haunts where the squirrels went for nuts, the white oak whose bark was most valuable, and the little gold thread vine that Nursey liked to cure the canker with. All sorts of splendid red and yellow leaves did Dan bring home for Mrs. Jo to dress her parlor with, graceful seeded grasses, clematis tassels, downy soft yellow waxwork berries, and mosses red-brimmed white or emerald green. "I need not sigh for the woods now, because Dan brings the woods to me," Mrs. Jo used to say, as she glorified the walls with yellow maple boughs and scarlet woodbine wreaths, or filled her vases with russet ferns, hemlock sprays full of delicate cones, and hardy autumn flowers, for Dan's crops suited her well. The great garret was full of the children's little stores, and for a time was one of the sights of the house. Daisy's flower seeds in neat little paper bags, all labeled, lay in a drawer of a 3-legged table. Nan's herbs hung in bunches against the wall, filling the air with their aromatic breath. Tommy had a basket of thistledown with the tiny seeds attached, for he meant to plant them next year, if they did not all fly away before that time. Emil had bunches of popcorn hanging there to dry, and Demi laid up acorns and different sorts of grain for the pets. But Dan's crop made the best show, for fully 1/2 of the floor was covered with the nuts he brought. All kinds were there, for he ranged the woods for miles round, climbed the tallest trees, and forced his way into the thickest hedges for his plunder. Walnuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, and beechnuts lay in separate compartments, getting brown and dry and sweet, ready for winter revels. There was one butternut tree on the place, and Rob and Teddy called it theirs. It bore well this year, and the great dingy nuts came dropping down to hide among the dead leaves, where the busy squirrels found them better than the lazy bears. Their father had told them, the boys, not the squirrels, they should have the nuts if they would pick them up, but no one was to help. It was easy work, and Teddy liked it, only he soon got tired, and left his little basket half full for another day. But the other day was slow to arrive, and meantime the sly squirrels were hard at work, scampering up and down the old elm trees, stowing the nuts away till their holes were full, then all about the crotches of the boughs, to be removed at their leisure. Their funny little ways amused the boys, till one day Silas said, "Have you sold them nuts to the squirrels?" "No," answered Rob, wondering what Silas meant. "Well, then you'd better fly round, or them spry little fellers won't leave you none." "Oh, we can beat them when we begin. There are such a lot of nuts, we shall have a plenty." "There ain't many more to come down, and they have cleared the ground pretty well, see if they ain't." Robbie ran to look, and was alarmed to find how few remained. He called Teddy, and they worked hard all one afternoon, while the squirrels sat on the fence and scolded. "Now, Ted, we must keep watch, and pick up just as fast as they fall, or we shan't have more than a bushel, and everyone will laugh at us if we don't." "The naughty quillies tarn't have 'em. I'll pick fast and run and put 'em in the barn twick," said Teddy, frowning at little Frisky, who chattered and whisked his tail indignantly. That night a high wind blew down hundreds of nuts, and when Mrs. Joe came to wake her little sons, she said briskly, "Come, my laddies, the squirrels are hard at it, and you will have to work well today, or they will have every nut on the ground." "No, they won't!" and Robbie tumbled up in a great hurry, gobbled his breakfast, and rushed out to save his property. Teddy went too, and worked like a little beaver, trotting to and fro with full and empty baskets. Another bushel was soon put away in the corn barn, and they were scrambling among the leaves for more nuts when the bell rang for school. "Oh, Father, let me stay out and pick! Those horrid squirrels will have my nuts if you don't! I'll do my lessons by and by!" cried Rob, running into the schoolroom, flushed and tousled by the fresh cold wind and his eager work. "If you had been up early and done a little every morning, there would be no hurry now." "I told you that, Rob, and you never minded. I cannot have the lessons neglected as the work has been. The squirrels will get more than their share this year, and they deserve it, for they have worked best. You may go an hour earlier, but that is all." And Mr. Bear led Rob to his place, where the little man dashed at his books as if bent on making sure of the precious hour promised him. It was almost maddening to sit still and see the wind shaking down the last nuts, and the lively thieves flying about, pausing now and then to eat one in his face, and flirt their tails, as if they said saucily, "We'll have them in spite of you, lazy Rob." The only thing that sustained the poor child in this trying moment was the sight of Teddy working away all alone. It was really splendid, the pluck and perseverance of the little lad. He picked and picked till his back ached. He trudged to and fro till his small legs were tired, and he defied wind, weariness, and wicked quillies, till his mother left her work and did the carrying for him, full of admiration for the kind little fellow who tried to help his brother. When Rob was dismissed, he found Teddy reposing in the bushel basket, quite used up, but unwilling to quit the field, for he flapped his hat at the thieves with one grubby little hand, while he refreshed himself with the big apple held in the other. Rob fell to work, and the ground was cleared before 2 o'clock, the nuts safely in the corn barn loft, and the weary workers exulted in their success. But Frisky and his wife were not to be vanquished so easily, and when Rob went up to look at his nuts a few days later, he was amazed to see how many had vanished. None of the boys could have stolen them, because the door had been locked, the doves could not have eaten them, and there were no rats about. There was great lamentation among the young bears, till Dick said, "I saw Frisky on the roof of the corn barn. Maybe he took them." "I know he did! I'll have a trap and kill him dead!" cried Rob, disgusted with Frisky's grasping nature. "Perhaps if you watch you can find out where he puts them, and I may be able to get them back for you," said Dan, who was much amused by the fight between the boys and squirrels. So Rob watched, and saw Mr. and Mrs. Frisky drop from the drooping elm boughs onto the roof of the corn barn, dodge in at one of the little doors, much to the disturbance of the doves, and come out with a nut in each mouth. So laden they could not get back the way they came, but ran down the low roof, along the wall, and leaping off at a corner they vanished a minute and reappeared without their plunder. Rob ran to the place, and in a hollow under the leaves he found a heap of the stolen property, hidden away to be carried off to the holes by and by. "Oh, you little villains! I'll cheat you now and not leave one," said Rob. So he cleared the corner and the corn barn, and put the contested nuts in the garret, making sure that no broken window pane could anywhere let in the unprincipled squirrels. They seemed to feel that the contest was over, and retired to their hole, but now and then could not resist throwing down nutshells on Rob's head, and scolding violently, as if they could not forgive him, nor forget that he had the best of the battle. Father and Mother Bear's crop was of a different sort, and not so easily described, but they were satisfied with it, felt that their summer work had prospered well, and by had a harvest that made them very happy. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 19. John Brooke. "Wake up, Demi, dear. I want you." "Why, I've just gone to bed. It can't be morning yet." And Demi blinked like a little owl as he waked from his first sound sleep. "It's only 10, but your father is ill and we must go to him. Oh, my little John, my poor little John." And Aunt Jo laid her head down on the pillow with a sob that scared sleep from Demi's eyes and filled his heart with fear and wonder, for he dimly felt why Aunt Jo called him John, and wept over him as if some loss had come that left him poor. He clung to her without a word, and in a minute she was quite steady again, and said with a tender kiss as she saw his troubled face, "We are going to say good-bye to him, my darling, and there is no time to lose, so dress quickly and come to me in my room. I must go to Daisy." "Yes, I will." And when Aunt Jo was gone, little Demi got up quietly, dressed as if in a dream, and leaving Tommy fast asleep, went away through the silent house, feeling that something new and sorrowful was going to happen, something that set him apart from the other boys for a time, and made the world seem as dark and still and strange as those familiar rooms did in the night. A carriage sent by Mr. Lorry stood before the door. Daisy was soon ready, and the brother and sister held each other by the hand all the way into town as they drove swiftly and silently with Aunt and Uncle through the shadowy roads to say good-bye to Father. None of the boys but Franz and Emil knew what had happened, and when they came down next morning great was their wonderment and discomfort, for the house seemed forlorn without its master and mistress. Breakfast was a dismal meal with no cheery Mrs. Jo behind the teapots, and when school-time came, Father Bear's place was empty. They wandered about in a disconsolate kind of way for an hour, waiting for news and hoping it would be all right with Demi's father, for good John Brooke was much beloved by the boys. 10 o'clock came, and no one arrived to relieve their anxiety. They did not feel like playing, yet the time dragged heavily, and they sat about listless and sober. All at once Franz got up and said in his persuasive way, "Look here, boys, let's go into school and do our lessons just as if Uncle was here. It will make the day go faster and will please him, I know." "But who will hear us say them?" asked Jack. "I will. I don't know much more than you do, but I'm the oldest here, and I'll try to fill Uncle's place till he comes, if you don't mind." Something in the modest, serious way Franz said this impressed the boys, for though the poor lad's eyes were red with quiet crying for Uncle John in that long, sad night, there was a new manliness about him, as if he had already begun to feel the cares and troubles of life and tried to take them bravely. "I will, for one," and Emil went to his seat, remembering that obedience to his superior officer is a seaman's first duty. The others followed. Franz took his uncle's seat, and for an hour order reigned. Lessons were learned and said, and Franz made a patient, pleasant teacher, wisely omitting such lessons as he was not equal to, and keeping order more by the unconscious dignity that sorrow gave him than by any words of his own. The little boys were reading when a step was heard in the hall, and everyone looked up to read the news in Mr. Bear's face as he came in. The kind face told them instantly that Demi had no father now, for it was worn and pale and full of tender grief, which left him no words with which to answer Rob as he ran to him, saying reproachfully, "What made you go and leave me in the night, Papa?" The memory of the other father who had left his children in the night, never to return, made Mr. Bear hold his own boy close, and for a minute hide his face in Robbie's curly hair. Emil laid his head down on his arms. Franz went to put his hand on his uncle's shoulder, his boyish face pale with sympathy and sorrow, and the others sat so still that the soft rustle of the falling leaves outside was distinctly heard. Rob did not clearly understand what had happened, but he hated to see Papa unhappy, so he lifted up the bent head and said in his chirpy little voice, "Don't cry, mein Vater. We were all so good. We did our lessons without you, and Franz was the master." Mr. Bear looked up then, tried to smile, and said in a grateful tone that made the lads feel like saints, "I thank you very much, my boys. It was a beautiful way to help and comfort me. I shall not forget it, I assure you." "Franz proposed it, and was a first-rate master, too," said Nat, and the others gave a murmur of assent most gratifying to the young dominie. Mr. Bear put Rob down, and standing up, put his arm round his tall nephew's shoulder as he said, with a look of genuine pleasure, "This makes my hard day easier, and gives me confidence in you all. I am needed there in town and must leave you for some hours. I thought to give you a holiday or send some of you home, but if you like to stay and go on as you have begun, I shall be glad and proud of my good boys." "We'll stay, we'd rather. Franz can see to us," cried several, delighted with the confidence shown in them. "Isn't Marmar coming home?" asked Rob wistfully, for home without Marmar was the world without the sun to him. "We shall both come tonight, but dear Aunt Meg needs Mother more than you do now, and I know you like to lend her for a little while." "Well, I will, but Teddy's been crying for her, and he slapped Nursey and was dreadful naughty," answered Rob, as if the news might bring Mother home. "Where is my little man?" asked Mr. Bear. "Dan took him out to keep him quiet. He's all right now," said Franz, pointing to the window, through which they could see Dan drawing Baby in his little wagon, with the dogs frolicking about him. "I won't see him. It would only upset him again, but tell Dan I leave Teddy in his care. You older boys I trust to manage yourselves for a day. Franz will direct you, and Silas is here to oversee matters. So good-bye till tonight." "Just tell me a word about Uncle John," said Emil, detaining Mr. Bear as he was about hurrying away again. "He was only ill a few hours, and died as he has lived, so cheerfully, so peacefully, that it seems a sin to mar the beauty of it with any violent or selfish grief. We were in time to say good-bye, and Daisy and Demi were in his arms as he fell asleep on Aunt Meg's breast. No more now, I cannot bear it." And Mr. Bear went hastily away, quite bowed with grief, for in John Brooke he had lost both friend and brother, and there was no one left to take his place. All that day the house was very still. The small boys played quietly in the nursery. The others, feeling as if Sunday had come in the middle of the week, spent it in walking, sitting in the willow or among their pets, all talking much of Uncle John, and feeling that something gentle, just, and strong had gone out of their little world, leaving a sense of loss that deepened every hour. At dusk, Mr. and Mrs. Bear came home alone, for Demi and Daisy were their mother's best comfort now and could not leave her. Poor Mrs. Jo seemed quite spent, and evidently needed the same sort of comfort, for her first words as she came up the stairs were, "Where is my baby?" "Here I is," answered a little voice as Dan put Teddy into her arms, adding as she hugged him close, "My Danny took care of me all day, and I was good." Mrs. Jo turned to thank the faithful nurse, but Dan was waving off the boys, who had gathered in the hall to meet her, and was saying in a low voice, "Keep back, she don't want to be bothered with us now." "No, don't keep back, I want you all. Come in and see me, my boys, I've neglected you all day." And Mrs. Jo held out her hands to them as they gathered round, and escorted her into her own room, saying little, but expressing much by affectionate looks and clumsy little efforts to show their sorrow and sympathy. "I am so tired I will lie here and cuddle Teddy, and you shall bring me in some tea," she said, trying to speak cheerfully for their sakes. A general stampede into the dining-room followed, and the supper table would have been ravaged if Mr. Bear had not interfered. It was agreed that one squad should carry in the mother's tea and another bring it out. The four nearest and dearest claimed the first honor, so Franz bore the teapot, Emil the bread, Rob the milk, and Teddy insisted on carrying the sugar basin, which was lighter by several lumps when it arrived than when it started. Some women might have found it annoying at such a time to have boys creaking in and out, upsetting cups and rattling spoons in violent efforts to be quiet and helpful, but it suited Mrs. Jo, because just then her heart was very tender, and remembering that many of her boys were fatherless or motherless, she yearned over them, and found comfort in their blundering affection. It was the sort of food that did her more good than the very thick bread and butter that they gave her, and the rough Commodore's broken whisper, "Bear up, Auntie, it's a hard blow, but we'll weather it somehow," cheered her more than the sloppy cup he brought her, full of tea as bitter as if some salt tear of his own had dropped into it on the way. When supper was over, a second deputation removed the tray, and Dan said, holding out his arms for sleepy little Teddy, "Let me put him to bed. You're so tired, Mother." "Will you go with him, lovey?" asked Mrs. Jo of her small lord and master, who lay on her arm among the sofa pillows. "'Torse I will," and he was proudly carried off by his faithful bearer. "I wish I could do something," said Nat with a sigh, as Franz leaned over the sofa and softly stroked Aunt Jo's hot forehead. "You can, dear. Go and get your violin, and play me the sweet little airs Uncle Teddy sent you last. Music will comfort me better than anything else tonight." Nat flew for his fiddle, and sitting just outside her door, played as he had never done before, for now his heart was in it and seemed to magnetize his fingers. The other lads sat quietly upon the steps, keeping watch that no newcomer should disturb the house. Franz lingered at his post, and so, soothed, served, and guarded by her boys, poor Mrs. Jo slept at last, and forgot her sorrow for an hour. 2 quiet days, and on the third, Mr. Bear came in just after school with a note in his hand, looking both moved and pleased. "I want to read you something, boys," he said, and as they stood round him he read this. "Dear Brother Fritz, I hear that you do not mean to bring your flock today, thinking that I may not like it. Please do. The sight of his friends will help Demi through the hard hour, and I want the boys to hear what Father says of my John. It will do them good, I know. If they would sing one of the sweet old hymns you have taught them so well, I should like it better than any other music, and feel that it was beautifully suited to the occasion. Please ask them with my love. Meg." "Will you go?" And Mr. Bear looked at the lads, who were greatly touched by Mrs. Brooks' kind words and wishes. "Yes," they answered like one boy, and an hour later they went away with Franz to bear their part in John Brooks' simple funeral. The little house looked as quiet, sunny, and homelike as when Meg entered it as a bride 10 years ago, only then it was early summer, and rose blossomed everywhere. Now it was early autumn, and dead leaves rustled softly down, leaving the branches bare. The bride was a widow now, but the same beautiful serenity shone in her face, and the sweet resignation of a truly pious soul made her presence a consolation to those who came to comfort her. "Oh, Meg, how can you bear it so?" whispered Jo, as she met them at the door with a smile of welcome, and no change in her gentle manner except more gentleness. "Dear Jo, the love that has blessed me for 10 happy years supports me still. It could not die, and John is more my own than ever," whispered Meg, and in her eyes the tender trust was so beautiful and bright that Jo believed her, and thanked God for the immortality of love like hers. They were all there, Father and Mother, Uncle Teddy and Aunt Amy, old Mr. Lawrence, white-haired and feeble now, Mr. and Mrs. Bear with their flock, and many friends come to do honor to the dead. One would have said that modest John Brooke in his busy, quiet, humble life had had little time to make friends, but now they seemed to start up everywhere, old and young, rich and poor, high and low, for all unconsciously his influence had made itself widely felt, his virtues were remembered, and his hidden charities rose up to bless him. The group about his coffin was a far more eloquent eulogy than any Mr. March could utter. There were the rich men whom he had served faithfully for years, the poor old women whom he cherished with his little store in memory of his mother, the wife to whom he had given such happiness that death could not mar it utterly, the brothers and sisters in whose hearts he had made a place forever, the little son and daughter who already felt the loss of his strong arm and tender voice, the young children sobbing for their kindest playmate, and the tall lads watching with softened faces a scene which they never could forget. A very simple service, and very short, for the fatherly voice that had faltered in the marriage sacrament now failed entirely, as Mr. March endeavored to pay his tribute of reverence and love to the son whom he most honored. Nothing but the soft coo of baby Josie's voice upstairs broke the long hush that followed the last amen, till, at a sign from Mr. Bhaer, the well-trained boyish voices broke out in a hymn, so full of lofty cheer that one by one all joined in it, singing with full hearts and finding their troubled spirits lifted into peace on the wings of that brave, sweet psalm. As Meg listened, she felt that she had done well, for not only did the moment comfort her with the assurance that John's last lullaby was sung by the young voices he loved so well, but in the faces of the boys she saw that they had caught a glimpse of the beauty of virtue in its most impressive form, and that the memory of the good man lying dead before them would live long and helpfully in their remembrance. Daisy's head lay in her lap, and Demi held her hand, looking often at her, with eyes so like his father's, and a little gesture that seemed to say, "Don't be troubled, mother, I am here." And all about her were friends to lean upon and love, so patient, pious Meg put by her heavy grief, feeling that her best help would be to live for others as her John had done. That evening, as the Plumfield boys sat on the steps as usual in the mild September moonlight, they naturally fell to talking of the event of the day. Emil began by breaking out in his impetuous way. "Uncle Fritz is the wisest, and Uncle Laurie the jolliest, but Uncle John was the best, and I'd rather be like him than any man I ever saw." "So would I. Did you hear what those gentlemen said to Grandpa today? I would like to have that said of me when I was dead." And Franz felt with regret that he had not appreciated Uncle John enough. "What did they say?" asked Jack, who had been much impressed by the scenes of the day. "Why, one of the partners of Mr. Lawrence, where Uncle John has been ever so long, was saying that he was conscientious almost to a fault as a business man, and above reproach in all things. Another gentleman said no money could repay the fidelity and honesty with which Uncle John had served him, and then Grandpa told them the best of all. Uncle John once had a place in the office of a man who cheated, and when this man wanted Uncle to help him do it, Uncle wouldn't, though he was offered a big salary. The man was angry and said, 'You will never get on in business with such strict principles,' and Uncle answered back, 'I never will try to get on without them,' and left the place for a much harder and poorer one." "Good!" cried several of the boys warmly, for they were in the mood to understand and value the little story as never before. "He wasn't rich, was he?" asked Jack. "No." "He never did anything to make a stir in the world, did he?" "No." "He was only good?" "That's all." And Franz found himself wishing that Uncle John had done something to boast of, for it was evident that Jack was disappointed by his replies. "Only good. That is all and everything," said Mr. Bhaer, who had overheard the last few words, and guessed what was going on in the minds of the lads. "Let me tell you a little about John Brooke, and you will see why men honor him, and why he was satisfied to be good, rather than rich or famous. He simply did his duty in all things, and did it so cheerfully, so faithfully, that it kept him patient and brave and happy through poverty and loneliness and years of hard work. He was a good son, and gave up his own plans to stay and live with his mother while she needed him. He was a good friend, and taught Laurie much beside his Greek and Latin, did it unconsciously perhaps by showing him an example of an upright man. He was a faithful servant, and made himself so valuable to those who employed him that they will find it hard to fill his place. He was a good husband and father, so tender, wise, and thoughtful that Laurie and I learned much of him, and only knew how well he loved his family when we discovered all he had done for them, unsuspected and unassisted." Mr. Bhaer stopped a minute, and the boys sat like statues in the moonlight until he went on again, in a subdued but earnest voice. "As he lay dying, I said to him, 'Have no care for Meg and the little ones, I will see that they never want.' Then he smiled, and pressed my hand, and answered in his cheerful way, 'No need of that, I have cared for them.' And so he had, for when we looked among his papers all was in order, not a debt remained, and safely put away was enough to keep Meg comfortable and independent. Then we knew why he had lived so plainly, denied himself so many pleasures except that of charity, and worked so hard that I fear he shortened his good life. He never asked help for himself, though often for others, but bore his own burden and worked out his own task bravely and quietly. No one can say a word of complaint against him, so just and generous and kind was he, and now, when he is gone, all find so much to love and praise and honor that I am proud to have been his friend, and would rather leave my children the legacy he leaves than the largest fortune ever made. Yes, simple, generous goodness is the best capital to found the business of this life upon. It lasts when fame and money fail, and is the only riches we can take out of this world with us. Remember that, my boys, and if you want to earn respect and confidence and love, follow in the footsteps of John Brooke." When Demi returned to school after some weeks at home, he seemed to have recovered from his loss with the blessed elasticity of childhood, and so he had, in a measure, but he did not forget, for his was a nature into which things sank deeply, to be pondered over and absorbed into the soil where the small virtues were growing fast. He played and studied, worked and sang just as before, and few suspected any change, but there was one, and Aunt Jo saw it, for she watched over the boy with her whole heart, trying to fill John's place in her poor way. He seldom spoke of his loss, but Aunt Jo often heard a stifled sobbing in the little bed at night, and when she went to comfort him, all his cry was, "I want my father! Oh, I want my father!" For the tie between the two had been a very tender one, and the child's heart bled when it was broken. But time was kind to him, and slowly he came to feel that father was not lost, only invisible for a while, and sure to be found again, well and strong and fond as ever, even though his little son should see the purple asters blossom on his grave many, many times before they met. To this belief Demi held fast, and in it found both help and comfort, because it led him unconsciously through a tender longing for the father whom he had seen, to a childlike trust in the father whom he had not seen. Both were in heaven, and he prayed to both, trying to be good for love of them. The outward change corresponded to the inward, for in those few weeks Demi seemed to have grown tall, and began to drop his childish plays, not as if ashamed of them as some boys do, but as if he had outgrown them, and wanted something manlier. He took to the hated arithmetic, and held on so steadily that his uncle was charmed, though he could not understand the whim until Demi said, "I am going to be a bookkeeper when I grow up like Papa, and I must know about figures and things, else I can't have nice neat ledgers like his." At another time he came to his aunt with a very serious face and said, "What can a small boy do to earn money?" "Why do you ask, my dearie?" "My father told me to take care of mother and the little girls, and I want to, but I don't know how to begin." "He did not mean now, Demi, but by and by when you are large." "But I wish to begin now, if I can, because I think I ought to make some money to buy things for the family. I am 10, and other boys no bigger than I earn pennies sometimes." "Well, then, suppose you rake up all the dead leaves and cover the strawberry bed. I'll pay you $1 for the job," said Aunt Jo. "Isn't that a great deal? I could do it in one day. You must be fair, and not pay too much, because I want to truly earn it." "My little John, I will be fair, and not pay a penny too much. Don't work too hard, and when that is done I will have something else for you to do," said Mrs. Jo, much touched by his desire to help and his sense of justice, so like his scrupulous father. When the leaves were done, many barrel-loads of chips were wheeled from the wood to the shed, and another $1 earned. Then Demi helped cover the school books, working in the evenings under Franz's direction, tugging patiently away at each book, letting no one help, and receiving his wages with such satisfaction that the dingy bills became quite glorified in his sight. "Now I have $1 for each of them, and I should like to take my money to mother all myself, so she can see that I have minded my father." So Demi made a duteous pilgrimage to his mother, who received his little earnings as a treasure of great worth, and would have kept it untouched, if Demi had not begged her to buy some useful thing for herself and the women children, whom he felt were left to his care. This made him very happy, and though he often forgot his responsibilities for a time, the desire to help was still there, strengthening with his years. He always uttered the words, "my father," with an air of gentle pride, and often said, as if he claimed a title full of honor, "Don't call me Demi any more. I am John Brooke now." So, strengthened by purpose and hope, the little lad of 10 bravely began the world, and entered into his inheritance. The memory of a wise and tender father, the legacy of an honest name. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 20. Round the Fire. With the October frosts came the cheery fires in the great fireplaces, and Demi's dry pine chips helped Dan's oak knots to blaze royally and go roaring up the chimney with a jolly sound. All were glad to gather round the hearth, as the evenings grew longer, to play games, read, or lay plans for the winter. But the favorite amusement was story-telling, and Mr. and Mrs. Bhaer were expected to have a store of lively tales always on hand. Their supply occasionally gave out, and then the boys were thrown upon their own resources, which were not always successful. Ghost parties were the rage at one time, for the fun of the thing consisted in putting out the lights, letting the fire die down, and then sitting in the dark, telling the most awful tales they could invent. As this resulted in scares of all sorts among the boys, Tommy's walking in his sleep on the shed roof, and a general state of nervousness in the little ones, it was forbidden, and they fell back on more harmless amusements. One evening, when the small boys were snugly tucked in bed, and the older lads were lounging about the schoolroom fire, trying to decide what they should do, Demi suggested a new way of settling the question. Seizing the hearth-brush, he marched up and down the room, saying, "Row, row, row!" And when the boys, laughing and pushing, had got into line, he said, "Now, I'll give you 2 minutes to think of a play." Franz was writing, and Emil reading the Life of Lord Nelson, and neither joined the party, but the others thought hard, and when the time was up, were ready to reply. "Now, Tom," and the poker softly rapped him on the head. "Blind man's buff." "Jack?" "Commerce, a good round game, and have cents for the pool." "Uncle forbids our playing for money. Dan, what do you want?" "Let's have a battle between the Greeks and Romans." "Stuffy?" "Roast apples, popcorn, and cracked nuts." "Good, good!" cried several, and when the vote was taken, Stuffy's proposal carried the day. Some went to the cellar for apples, some to the garret for nuts, and others looked up the popper and the corn. "We had better ask the girls to come in, hadn't we?" said Demi in a sudden fit of politeness. "Daisy pricks chestnuts beautifully," put in Nat, who wanted his little friend to share the fun. "Nan pops corn tip-top, we must have her," added Tommy. "Bring in your sweethearts, then, we don't mind," said Jack, who laughed at the innocent regard the little people had for one another. "You shan't call my sister a sweetheart, it is so silly," cried Demi, in a way that made Jack laugh. "She is Nat's darling, isn't she, old chirper?" "Yes, if Demi don't mind. I can't help being fond of her, she is so good to me," answered Nat with bashful earnestness, for Jack's rough ways disturbed him. "Nan is my sweetheart, and I shall marry her in about a year, so don't you get in the way, any of you," said Tommy stoutly, for he and Nan had settled their future child fashion, and were to live in the willow, lower down a basket for food, and do other charmingly impossible things. Demi was quenched by the decision of Bangs, who took him by the arm and walked him off to get the ladies. Nan and Daisy were sewing with Aunt Jo on certain small garments for Mrs. Kearney's newest baby. "Please, ma'am, could you lend us the girls for a little while? We'll be very careful of them," said Tommy, winking one eye to express apples, snapping his fingers to signify popcorn, and gnashing his teeth to convey the idea of nut-cracking. The girls understood this pantomime at once, and began to pull off their thimbles before Mrs. Jo could decide whether Tommy was going into convulsions, or was brewing some unusual piece of mischief. Demi explained with elaboration. Permission was readily granted, and the boys departed with their prize. "Don't you speak to Jack," whispered Tommy, as he and Nan promenaded down the hall to get a fork to prick the apples. "Why not?" "He laughs at me, so I don't wish you to have anything to do with him." "Shall if I like," said Nan, promptly resenting this premature assumption of authority on the part of her lord. "Then I won't have you for my sweetheart." "I don't care." "Why, Nan, I thought you were fond of me," and Tommy's voice was full of tender reproach. "If you mind Jack's laughing, I don't care for you one bit." "Then you may take back your old ring. I won't wear it any longer." And Tommy plucked off a horsehair pledge of affection which Nan had given him in return for one made of a lobster's feeler. "I shall give it to Ned," was her cruel reply, for Ned liked Mrs. Giddy-Gaddy, and had turned her clothespins, boxes, and spools enough to set up housekeeping with. Tommy said, "Thunder turtles!" as the only vent equal to the pent-up anguish of the moment, and dropping Nan's arm, retired in high dudgeon, leaving her to follow with the fork, a neglect which naughty Nan punished by proceeding to prick his heart with jealousy, as if it were another sort of apple. The hearth was swept, and the rosy Baldwins put down to roast. A shovel was heated, and the chestnuts danced merrily upon it, while the corn popped wildly in its wire prison. Dan cracked his best walnuts, and everyone chatted and laughed, while the rain beat on the window pane, and the wind howled round the house. "Why is Billy like this nut?" asked Emil, who was frequently inspired with bad conundrums. "Because he is cracked," answered Ned. "That's not fair. You mustn't make fun of Billy, because he can't hit back again. It's mean," cried Dan, smashing a nut wrathfully. "To what family of insects does Blake belong?" asked Peacemaker Franz, seeing that Emil looked ashamed and Dan lowering. "Gnats," answered Jack. "Why is Daisy like a bee?" cried Nat, who had been wrapped in thought for several minutes. "Because she is queen of the hive," said Dan. "No." "Because she is sweet." "Bees are not sweet." "Give it up." "Because she makes sweet things, is always busy, and likes flowers," said Nat, piling up his boyish compliments till Daisy blushed like a rosy clover. "Why is Nan like a hornet?" demanded Tommy, glowering at her, and adding without giving anyone time to answer, "Because she isn't sweet, makes a great buzzing about nothing, and stings like fury." "Tommy's mad, and I'm glad," cried Ned, as Nan tossed her head and answered quickly, "What thing in the china closet is Tom like?" "A pepper pot," answered Ned, giving Nan a nut meat with a tantalizing laugh that made Tommy feel as if he would like to bounce up like a hot chestnut and hit somebody. Seeing that ill humor was getting the better of the small supply of wit in the company, Franz cast himself into the breach again. "Let's make a law that the first person who comes into the room shall tell us a story. No matter who it is, he must do it, and it will be fun to see who comes first." The others agreed, and did not have to wait long, for a heavy step soon came clumping through the hall, and Silas appeared bearing an armful of wood. He was greeted by a general shout, and stood staring about him with a bewildered grin on his big red face, till Franz explained the joke. "Sho, I can't tell a story," he said, putting down his load and preparing to leave the room. But the boys fell upon him, forced him into a seat, and held him there, laughing and clamoring for their story till the good-natured giant was overpowered. "I don't know but just one story, and that's about a horse," he said, much flattered by the reception he received. "Tell it! Tell it!" cried the boys. "Well," began Silas, tipping his chair back against the wall, and putting his thumbs in the armholes of his waistcoat, "I joined a cavalry regiment during the war, and see a considerable amount of fighting. My horse Major was a first-rate animal, and I was as fond on him as if he'd been a human critter. He warn't handsome, but he was the best-tempered, stiddiest, lovin'est brute I ever see. The first battle we went into, he gave me a lesson that I didn't forget in a hurry, and I'll tell you how it was. It ain't no use trying to picter the noise and hurry and general horridness of a battle to you young fellers, for I ain't no words to do it in, but I'm free to confess that I got so sort of confused and upset at the fust on it that I didn't know what I was about. We was ordered to charge, and went ahead like good ones, never stopping to pick up them that went down in the scrimmage. I got a shot in the arm, and was pitched out of the saddle don't know how, but there I was left behind with 2 or 3 others dead and wounded, for the rest went on, as I say. Well, I picked myself up and looked round for Major, feeling as if I'd had about enough for that spell. I didn't see him nowhere, and was kinder walking back to camp when I heard a whinny that sounded natural. I looked round, and there was Major, stopping for me a long way off, and looking as if he didn't understand why I was loitering behind. I whistled, and he trotted up to me as I'd trained him to do. I mounted as well as I could with my left arm bleeding, and was for going on to camp, for I declare I felt as sick and wimbly as a woman. Folks often do in their first battle. But no, sir, Major was the bravest of the two, and he wouldn't go, not a peg. He just reared up and danced and snorted and acted as if the smell of powder and the noise had drove him half wild. I done my best, but he wouldn't give in, so I did. And what do you think that plucky brute done? He wheeled slap round and galloped back like a hurricane right into the thickest of the scrimmage. "Good for him!" cried Dan excitedly, while the other boys forgot apples and nuts in their interest. "I wish I may die if I weren't ashamed of myself," continued Silas, warming up at the recollection of that day. "I was mad as a hornet, and I forgot my wound, and just pitched in, rampaging around like fury, till there came a shell into the midst of us, and in bustin' knocked a lot of us flat. I didn't know nothing for a spell, and when I come to, the fight was over just there, and I found myself layin' by a wall, a poor Major alongside, worse wounded than I was. My leg was broke, and I had a ball in my shoulder, but he, poor old fellow, was all tore in the side with a piece of that blasted shell." "Oh, Silas, what did you do?" cried Nan, pressing close to him with a face full of eager sympathy and interest. "I dragged myself nigher and tried to stop the bleeding with such rags as I could tear off me with one hand, but it warn't no use, and he lay moaning with horrid pain and looking at me with them loving eyes of his till I thought I couldn't bear it. I give him all the help I could, and when the sun got hotter and hotter and he began to lap out his tongue, I tried to get to a brook that was a good piece away, but I couldn't do it, being stiff and faint, so I give it up and fanned him with my hat. Now you listen to this, and when you hear folks coming down on the rebs, you just remember what one on 'em did, and give him credit of it. A poor fellow in gray laid not far off, shot through the lungs and dying fast. I'd offered him my handkerchief to keep the sun off his face, and he thanked me kindly, for in such times as that, men don't stop to think on which side they belong, but just buckle to and help one another. When he see me mourning over Major and trying to ease his pain, he looked up with his face all damp and white with suffering, and says he, 'There's water in my canteen, take it, for it can't help me,' and he flung it to me. I couldn't have took it if I hadn't had a little brandy in a pocket flask, and I made him drink it. It done him good, and I felt as much set up as if I'd drunk it myself. It's surprising the good such little things do folks sometimes." And Silas paused as if he felt again the comfort of that moment when he and his enemy forgot their feud and helped one another like brothers. "Tell about Major!" cried the boys, impatient for the catastrophe. "I poured the water over his poor pantin' tongue, and if ever a dumb critter looked grateful, he did then. But it warn't of much use, for the dreadful wound kept on tormentin' him till I couldn't bear it any longer. It was hard, but I done it in mercy, and I know he forgive me." "What did you do?" asked Emil, as Silas stopped abruptly with a loud ahem, and a look in his rough face that made Daisy go and stand by him with her little hand on his knee. "I shot him." Quite a thrill went through the listeners as Silas said that, for Major seemed a hero in their eyes, and his tragic end roused all their sympathy. "Yes, I shot him and put him out of his misery. I patted him first and said good-bye, then I laid his head easy on the grass, give a last look into his loving eyes, and sent a bullet through his head. He hardly stirred, I aimed so true, and when I seen him quite still, with no more moaning and pain, I was glad, and yet, well, I don't know as I need to be ashamed on't. I just put my arms round his neck and boo-hooed like a great baby. Pshaw, I didn't know I was such a fool." And Silas drew his sleeve across his eyes, as much touched by Daisy's sob as by the memory of faithful Major. No one spoke for a minute, because the boys were as quick to feel the pathos of the little story as tender-hearted Daisy, though they did not show it by crying. "I'd like a horse like that," said Dan half aloud. "Did the rebel man die too?" asked Nan anxiously. "Not then. We laid there all day, and at night some of our fellers came to look after the missing ones. They naturally wanted to take me first, but I knew I could wait, and the rebel had but one chance maybe, so I made them carry him off right away. He had just strength enough to hold out his hand to me and say, 'Thank you, comrade,' and them was the last words he spoke, for he died an hour after he got to the hospital tent." "How glad you must have been that you were kind to him," said Demi, who was deeply impressed by this story. "Well, I did take comfort thinking of it, as I laid there alone for a number of hours with my head on Major's neck and see the moon come up. I'd like to have buried the poor beast decent, but it weren't possible, so I cut off a bit of his mane, and I've kept it ever since. Want to see it, Sissy?" "Oh, yes, please," answered Daisy, wiping away her tears to look. Silas took out an old wallet, as he called his pocketbook, and produced from an inner fold a bit of brown paper, in which was a rough lock of white horsehair. The children looked at it silently, as it lay in the broad palm, and no one found anything to ridicule in the love Silas bore his good horse Major. "That is a sweet story, and I like it, though it did make me cry. Thank you very much, Si." And Daisy helped him fold and put away his little relic, while Nan stuffed a handful of popcorn into his pocket, and the boys loudly expressed their flattering opinions of his story, feeling that there had been 2 heroes in it. He departed, quite overcome by his honors, and the little conspirators talked the tale over, while they waited for their next victim. It was Mrs. Joe, who came in to measure Nan for some new pinafores she was making for her. They let her get well in, then pounced upon her, telling her the law and demanding the story. Mrs. Joe was very much amused at the new trap, and consented at once, for the sound of happy voices had been coming across the hall so pleasantly that she quite longed to join them, and forget her own anxious thoughts of Sister Meg. "Am I the first mouse you have caught, you sly pussies in boots?" she asked, as she was conducted to the big chair, supplied with refreshments, and surrounded by a flock of merry-faced listeners. They told her about Silas and his contribution, and she slapped her forehead in despair, for she was quite at her wits' end, being called upon so unexpectedly for a brand-new tale. "What shall I tell about?" she said. "Boys!" was the general answer. "Have a party in it," said Daisy. "And something good to eat," added Stuffy. "That reminds me of a story written years ago by a dear old lady. I used to be very fond of it, and I fancy you will like it, for it has both boys and something good to eat in it." "What is it called?" asked Demi. "The Suspected Boy." Nat looked up from the nuts he was picking, and Mrs. Joe smiled at him, guessing what was in his mind. Miss Crane kept a school for boys in a quiet little town, and a very good school it was, of the old-fashioned sort. 6 boys lived in her house, and 4 or 5 more came in from the town. Among those who lived with her was one named Louis White. Louis was not a bad boy, but rather timid, and now and then he told a lie. One day a neighbor sent Miss Crane a basket of gooseberries. There were not enough to go round, so kind Miss Crane, who liked to please her boys, went to work and made a dozen nice little gooseberry tarts. "I'd like to try gooseberry tarts. I wonder if she made them as I do my raspberry ones," said Daisy, whose interest in cooking had lately revived. "Hush," said Nat, tucking a plump popcorn into her mouth to silence her, for he felt a particular interest in this tale and thought it opened well. When the tarts were done, Miss Crane put them away in the best parlor closet, and said not a word about them, for she wanted to surprise the boys at tea-time. When the minute came and all were seated at table, she went to get her tarts, but came back looking much troubled, for what do you think had happened? "Somebody had hooked them!" cried Ned. No, there they were, but someone had stolen all the fruit out of them by lifting up the upper crust and then putting it down after the gooseberry had been scraped out. "What a mean trick!" and Nan looked at Tommy as if to imply that he would do the same. When she told the boys her plan and showed them the poor little patties all robbed of their sweetness, the boys were much grieved and disappointed, and all declared they knew nothing about the matter. "Perhaps the rats did it," said Louis, who was among the loudest to deny any knowledge of the tarts. "No, rats would have nibbled crust and all, and never lifted it up and scooped out the fruit. Hands did that," said Miss Crane, who was more troubled about the lie that someone must have told than about her lost patties. Well, they had supper and went to bed, but in the night Miss Crane heard someone groaning, and going to see who it was, she found Louis in great pain. He had evidently eaten something that disagreed with him, and was so sick that Miss Crane was alarmed, and was going to send for the doctor, when Louis moaned out, "It's the gooseberries! I ate them, and I must tell before I die!" For the thought of a doctor frightened him. "If that is all, I'll give you an emetic, and you will soon get over it," said Miss Crane. So Louis had a good dose, and by morning was quite comfortable. "Oh, don't tell the boys, they will laugh at me so," begged the invalid. Kind Miss Crane promised not to, but Sally, the girl, told the story, and poor Louis had no peace for a long time. His mates called him Old Gooseberry, and were never tired of asking him the price of tarts. "Served him right," said Emil. "Badness always gets found out," added Demi morally. "No, it don't," muttered Jack, who was tending the apples with great devotion, so that he might keep his back to the rest and account for his red face. "Is that all?" asked Dan. "No, that is only the first part. The second part is more interesting. Some time after this a peddler came by one day and stopped to show his things to the boys, several of whom bought pocket combs, jews' harps, and various trifles of that sort. Among the knives was a little white-handled penknife that Louis wanted very much, but he had spent all his pocket money, and no one had any to lend him. He held the knife in his hand, admiring and longing for it, till the man packed up his goods to go. Then he reluctantly laid it down, and the man went on his way. The next day, however, the peddler returned to say that he could not find that very knife, and thought he must have left it at Miss Crane's. It was a very nice one with a pearl handle, and he could not afford to lose it. Everyone looked, and everyone declared they knew nothing about it. "This young gentleman had it last, and seemed to want it very much. Are you quite sure you put it back?" said the man to Louis, who was much troubled at the loss, and vowed over and over again that he did return it. His denials seemed to do no good, however, for everyone was sure he had taken it, and after a stormy scene Miss Crane paid for it, and the man went grumbling away. "Did Louis have it?" cried Nat, much excited. "You will see. Now, poor Louis had another trial to bear, for the boys were constantly saying, 'Lend me your pearl-handled knife, Gooseberry,' and things of that sort, till Louis was so unhappy he begged to be sent home. Miss Crane did her best to keep the boys quiet, but it was hard work, for they would tease, and she could not be with them all the time. That is one of the hardest things to teach boys. They won't hit a fellow when he is down, as they say, but they will torment him in little ways till he would thank them to fight it out all round." "I know that," said Dan. "So do I," added Nat softly. Jack said nothing, but he quite agreed, for he knew that the elder boys despised him, and let him alone for that very reason. "Do go on about poor Louis, Aunt Jo. I don't believe he took the knife, but I want to be sure," said Daisy in great anxiety. Well, week after week went on, and the matter was not cleared up. The boys avoided Louis, and he, poor fellow, was almost sick with the trouble he had brought upon himself. He resolved never to tell another lie, and tried so hard that Miss Crane pitied and helped him, and really came at last to believe that he did not take the knife. 2 months after the peddler's first visit he came again, and the first thing he said was, "Well, ma'am, I found that knife after all. It had slipped behind the lining of my valise and fell out the other day when I was putting in a new stock of goods. I thought I'd call and let you know, as you paid for it and maybe would like it, so here it is." The boys had all gathered round, and at these words they felt much ashamed, and begged Louis's pardon so heartily that he could not refuse to give it. Miss Crane presented the knife to him, and he kept it many years to remind him of the fault that had brought him so much trouble. "I wonder why it is that things you eat on the sly hurt you and don't when you eat them at table," observed Stuffy thoughtfully. "Perhaps your conscience affects your stomach," said Mrs. Jo, smiling at his speech. "He's thinking of the cucumbers," said Ned, and a gale of merriment followed the words, for Stuffy's last mishap had been a funny one. He ate 2 large cucumbers in private, felt very ill, and confided his anguish to Ned, imploring him to do something. Ned good-naturedly recommended a mustard plaster and a hot flat-iron to the feet, only in applying these remedies he reversed the order of things, and put the plaster on the feet, the flat-iron on the stomach, and poor Stuffy was found in the barn with blistered soles and a scorched jacket. "Suppose you tell another story, that was such an interesting one," said Nat, as the laughter subsided. Before Mrs. Jo could refuse these insatiable Oliver twists, Rob walked into the room trailing his little bed-cover after him, and wearing an expression of great sweetness as he said, steering straight to his mother as a sure haven of refuge, "I heard a great noise, and I thought something dreadful must have happened, so I came to see." "Did you think I would forget you, naughty boy?" asked his mother, trying to look stern. "No, but I thought you'd feel better to see me right here," responded the insinuating little party. "I had much rather see you in bed, so march straight up again, Robin." "Everybody that comes in here has to tell a story, and you can't, so you'd better cut and run," said Emil. "Yes, I can. I tell Teddy lots of ones, all about bears and moons and little flies that say things when they buzz," protested Rob, bound to stay at any price. "Tell one now, then, right away," said Dan, preparing to shoulder and bear him off. "Well, I will. Let me think a minute." And Rob climbed into his mother's lap, where he was cuddled with the remark, "It is a family failing, this getting out of bed at wrong times. Demi used to do it, and as for me, I was hopping in and out all night long. Meg used to think the house was on fire and send me down to see, and I used to stay and enjoy myself as you mean to, my bad son." "I think now," observed Rob, quite at his ease and eager to win the entree into this delightful circle. Everyone looked and listened with faces full of suppressed merriment as Rob, perched on his mother's knee and wrapped in the gay coverlet, told the following brief but tragic tale with an earnestness that made it very funny. "Once a lady had 1,000,000 children and one nice little boy. She went upstairs and said, 'You mustn't go in the yard,' but he wented and fell into the pump and was drowned dead." "Is that all?" asked Franz, as Rob paused out of breath with this startling beginning. "No, there's another piece of it," and Rob knit his downy eyebrows in the effort to evolve another inspiration. "What did the lady do when he fell into the pump?" asked his mother to help him on. "Oh, she pumped him up and wrapped him in a newspaper and put him on a shelf to dry for seed." A general explosion of laughter greeted this surprising conclusion, and Mrs. Joe patted the curly head as she said solemnly, "My son, you inherit your mother's gift of storytelling. Go where glory waits thee." "Now I can stay, can't I? Wasn't it a good story?" cried Rob, in high feather at his superb success. "You can stay till you have eaten these 12 popcorns," said his mother, expecting to see them vanish at one mouthful. But Rob was a shrewd little man and got the better of her by eating them one by one very slowly and enjoying every minute with all his might. "Hadn't you better tell the other story while you wait for him?" said Demi, anxious that no time should be lost. "I really have nothing but a little tale about a wood box," said Mrs. Joe, seeing that Rob still had 7 corns to eat. "Is there a boy in it?" "It is all boy." "Is it true?" asked Demi. "Every bit of it." "Goody! Tell on, please." James Snow and his mother lived in a little house up in New Hampshire. They were poor, and James had to work to help his mother, but he loved books so well he hated work and just wanted to sit and study all day long. "How could he? I hate books and like work," said Dan, objecting to James at the very outset. "It takes all sorts of people to make a world. Workers and students both are needed, and there is room for all. But I think the workers should study some, and the students should know how to work if necessary," answered Mrs. Joe, looking from Dan to Demi with a significant expression. "I'm sure I do work," and Demi showed 3 small hard spots in his little palm with pride. "And I'm sure I study," added Dan, nodding with a groan toward the blackboard full of neat figures. See what James did. He did not mean to be selfish, but his mother was proud of him and let him do as he liked, working by herself that he might have books and time to read them. One autumn James wanted to go to school, and went to the minister to see if he would help him about decent clothes and books. Now the minister had heard the gossip about James's idleness, and was not inclined to do much for him, thinking that a boy who neglected his mother and let her slave for him was not likely to do very well even at school. But the good man felt more interested when he found how earnest James was, and being rather an odd man, he made this proposal to the boy to try how sincere he was. "I will give you clothes and books on one condition, James." "What is that, sir?" and the boy brightened up at once. "You are to keep your mother's wood box full all winter long, and do it yourself. If you fail, school stops." James laughed at the queer condition, and readily agreed to it, thinking it a very easy one. He began school, and for a time got on capitally with the wood box, for it was autumn, and chips and brushwood were plentiful. He ran out morning and evening and got a basketful, or chopped up the cat sticks for the little cooking stove, and as his mother was careful and saving, the task was not hard. But in November the frost came, the days were dull and cold, and wood went fast. His mother bought a load with her own earnings, but it seemed to melt away and was nearly gone before James remembered that he was to get the next. Mrs. Snow was feeble and lame with rheumatism, and unable to work as she had done, so James had to put down the books and see what he could do. It was hard, for he was going on well, and so interested in his lessons that he hated to stop except for food and sleep. But he knew the minister would keep his word, and much against his will, James set about earning money in his spare hours lest the wood box should get empty. He did all sorts of things, ran errands, took care of a neighbor's cow, helped the old sexton dust and warm the church on Sundays, and in these ways got enough to buy fuel in small quantities. But it was hard work. The days were short, the winter was bitterly cold, and precious time went fast, and the dear books were so fascinating that it was sad to leave them for dull duties that never seemed done. The minister watched him quietly, and seeing that he was in earnest, helped him without his knowledge. He met him often driving the wood sleds from the forest where the men were chopping, and as James plodded beside the slow oxen he read or studied, anxious to use every minute. "The boy is worth helping. This lesson will do him good, and when he has learned it I will give him an easier one," said the minister to himself, and on Christmas Eve a splendid load of wood was quietly dropped at the door of the little house, with a new saw and a bit of paper saying only, "The Lord helps those who help themselves." Poor James expected nothing, but when he woke on that cold Christmas morning he found a pair of warm mittens knit by his mother with her stiff, painful fingers. This gift pleased him very much, but her kiss and tender look as she called him her good son was better still. In trying to keep her warm, he had warmed his own heart, you see, and in filling the wood-box he had also filled those months with duties faithfully done. He began to see this, to feel that there was something better than books, and to try to learn the lessons God set him, as well as those his schoolmaster gave. When he saw the great pile of oak and pine logs at his door, and read the little paper, he knew who sent it, and understood the minister's plan, thanked him for it, and fell to work with all his might. Other boys frolicked that day, but James sawed wood, and I think of all the lads in the town the happiest was the one in the new mittens, who whistled like a blackbird as he filled his mother's wood-box. "That's a first-rater!" cried Dan, who enjoyed a simple matter-of-fact story better than the finest fairy tale. "I like that fellow after all." "I could saw wood for you, Aunt Jo," said Demi, feeling as if a new means of earning money for his mother was suggested by the story. "Tell about a bad boy. I like them best," said Nan. "You'd better tell about a naughty crosspatch of a girl," said Tommy, whose evening had been spoilt by Nan's unkindness. It made his apple taste bitter, his popcorn was insipid, his nuts were hard to crack, and the sight of Ned and Nan on one bench made him feel his life a burden. But there were no more stories from Mrs. Jo, for on looking down at Rob he was discovered to be fast asleep, with his last corn firmly clasped in his chubby hand. Bundling him up in his coverlet, his mother carried him away and tucked him in, with no fear of his popping out again. "Now, let's see who will come next," said Emil, setting the door temptingly ajar. Mary Ann passed first, and he called out to her, but Silas had warned her, and she only laughed and hurried on in spite of their enticements. Presently a door opened, and a strong voice was heard humming in the hall. "Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin." "It's Uncle Fritz! All laugh loud, and he will be sure to come in," said Emil. A wild burst of laughter followed, and in came Uncle Fritz, asking, "What is the joke, my lads?" "Caught! Caught! You can't go out till you've told a story!" cried the boys, slamming the door. "So that is the joke, then. Well, I have no wish to go. It is so pleasant here, and I pay my forfeit at once." Which he did, by sitting down and beginning instantly. "A long time ago, your grandfather, Demi, went to lecture in a great town, hoping to get some money for a home for little orphans that some good people were getting up. His lecture did well, and he put a considerable sum of money in his pocket, feeling very happy about it. As he was driving in a chaise to another town, he came to a lonely bit of road, late in the afternoon, and was just thinking what a good place it was for robbers, when he saw a bad-looking man come out of the woods in front of him, and go slowly along as if waiting till he came up. The thought of the money made grandfather rather anxious, and at first he had a mind to turn round and drive away. But the horse was tired, and then he did not like to suspect the man, so he kept on, and when he got nearer, and saw how poor and sick and ragged the stranger looked, his heart reproached him, and stopping, he said in a kind voice, "My friend, you look tired. Let me give you a lift." The man seemed surprised, hesitated a minute, and then got in. He did not seem inclined to talk, but grandfather kept on in his wise, cheerful way, speaking of what a hard year it had been, how much the poor had suffered, and how difficult it was to get on sometimes. The man slowly softened a little, and won by the kind chat told his story, how he had been sick, could get no work, had a family of children, and was almost in despair. Grandfather was so full of pity that he forgot his fear, and asking the man his name, said he would try to get him work in the next town, as he had friends there. Wishing to get at pencil and paper to write down the address, grandfather took out his plump pocket-book, and the minute he did so the man's eye was on it. Then grandfather remembered what was in it, and trembled for his money, but said quietly, "Yes, I have a little sum here for some poor orphans. I wish it was my own. I would so gladly give you some of it. I am not rich, but I know many of the trials of the poor. This $5 is mine, and I want to give it to you for your children." The hard, hungry look in the man's eyes changed to a grateful one as he took the small sum freely given and left the orphan's money untouched. He rode on with grandfather till they approached the town, then he asked to be set down. Grandpa shook hands with him, and was about to drive on when the man said, as if something made him, "I was desperate when we met, and I meant to rob you, but you were so kind I couldn't do it. God bless you, sir, for keeping me from it." "Did Grandpa ever see him again?" asked Daisy eagerly. "No, but I believe the man found work and did not try robbery any more." "That was a curious way to treat him. I'd have knocked him down," said Dan. "Kindness is always better than force. Try it and see," answered Mr. Bear, rising. "Tell another, please," cried Daisy. "You must. Aunt Jo did," added Demi. "Then I certainly won't, but keep my others for next time. Too many tales are as bad as too many bonbons. I have paid my forfeit, and I go." And Mr. Bear ran for his life with the whole flock in full pursuit. He had the start, however, and escaped safely into his study, leaving the boys to go rioting back again. They were so stirred up by the race that they could not settle to their former quiet, and a lively game of blindman's buff followed, in which Tommy showed that he had taken the moral of the last story to heart, for when he caught Nan, he whispered in her ear, "I'm sorry I called you a crosspatch." Nan was not to be outdone in kindness, so when they played Button, Button, Who's Got the Button, and it was her turn to go round, she said, "Hold fast all I give you," with such a friendly smile at Tommy that he was not surprised to find the horsehair ring in his hand instead of the button. He only smiled back at her then, but when they were going to bed he offered Nan the best bite of his last apple. She saw the ring on his stumpy little finger, accepted the bite, and peace was declared. Both were ashamed of the temporary coldness. Neither was ashamed to say, "I was wrong, forgive me." So the childish friendship remained unbroken, and the home in the willow lasted long, a pleasant little castle in the air. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Little Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 21. Thanksgiving. This yearly festival was always kept at Plumfield in the good old-fashioned way, and nothing was allowed to interfere with it. For days beforehand the little girls helped Asia and Mrs. Jo in storeroom and kitchen, making pies and puddings, sorting fruit, dusting dishes, and being very busy and immensely important. The boys hovered on the outskirts of the forbidden ground, sniffing the savory odors, peeping in at the mysterious performances, and occasionally being permitted to taste some delicacy in the process of preparation. Something more than usual seemed to be on foot this year, for the girls were as busy upstairs as down. So were the boys in schoolroom and barn, and a general air of bustle pervaded the house. There was a great hunting up of old ribbons and finery, much cutting and pasting of gold paper, and the most remarkable quantity of straw, gray cotton, flannel, and big black beads used by Franz and Mrs. Jo. Ned hammered at strange machines in the workshop. Demi and Tommy went about murmuring to themselves, as if learning something. A fearful racket was heard in Emil's room at intervals, and peals of laughter from the nursery, when Rob and Teddy were sent for and hidden from sight whole hours at a time. But the thing that puzzled Mr. Bhaer the most was what became of Rob's big pumpkin. It had been borne in triumph to the kitchen, where a dozen golden tinted pies soon after appeared. It would not have taken more than a quarter of the mammoth vegetable to make them, yet where was the rest? It disappeared, and Rob never seemed to care, only chuckled when it was mentioned, and told his father to wait and see, for the fun of the whole thing was to surprise Father Bhaer at the end, and not let him know a bit about what was to happen. He obediently shut eyes, ears, and mouth, and went about trying not to see what was in plain sight, not to hear the telltale sounds that filled the air, not to understand any of the perfectly transparent mysteries going on all about him. Being a German, he loved these simple domestic festivals, and encouraged them with all his heart, for they made home so pleasant that the boys did not care to go elsewhere for fun. When at last the day came, the boys went off for a long walk, that they might have good appetites for dinner, as if they ever needed them. The girls remained at home to help set the table and give last touches to various affairs which filled their busy little souls with anxiety. The schoolroom had been shut up since the night before, and Mr. Bhaer was forbidden to enter it on pain of a beating from Teddy, who guarded the door like a small dragon, though he was dying to tell about it, and nothing but his father's heroic self-denial in not listening kept him from betraying a grand secret. "It's all done, and it's perfectly splendid!" cried Nan, coming out at last with an air of triumph. "The goes beautifully, and Silas knows just what to do now," added Daisy, skipping with delight at some unspeakable success. I'm blest if it ain't the cutest thing I ever see. Them critters in particular," said Silas, who had been let into the secret, went off laughing like a great boy. "They're coming! I hear Emil roaring. Land lubbers lying down below! So we must run and dress," cried Nan, and upstairs they scampered in a great hurry. The boys came trooping home with appetites that would have made the big turkey tremble if it had not been past all fear. They also retired to dress, and for half an hour there was a washing, brushing, and prinking that would have done any tidy woman's heart good to see. When the bell rang, a troop of fresh-faced lads with shiny hair, clean collars, and Sunday jackets on filed into the dining room, where Mrs. Jo, in her one black silk, with a knot of her favorite white chrysanthemums in her bosom, sat at the head of the table, looking splendid, as the boys said whenever she got herself up. Daisy and Nan were as gay as a posy bed in their new winter dresses, with bright sashes and hair ribbons. Teddy was gorgeous to behold in a crimson merino blouse and his best button boots, which absorbed and distracted him as much as Mr. Toots's wristbands did on one occasion. As Mr. and Mrs. Bhaer glanced at each other down the long table, with those rows of happy faces on either side, they had a little Thanksgiving all to themselves, and without a word, for one heart said to the other, "Our work has prospered. Let us be grateful and go on." The clatter of knives and forks prevented much conversation for a few minutes, and Mary Ann, with an amazing pink bow in her hair, flew round, briskly, handing plates and ladling out gravy. Nearly every one had contributed to the feast, so the dinner was a peculiarly interesting one to the eaters of it, who beguiled the pauses by remarks on their own productions. "If these are not good potatoes, I never saw any," observed Jack, as he received his fourth big mealy one. "Some of my herbs are in the stuffing of the turkey. That's why it's so nice," said Nan, taking a mouthful with intense satisfaction. "My ducks are prime, anyway. Asia said she never cooked such fat ones," added Tommy. "Well, our carrots are beautiful, ain't they? And our parsnips will be ever so good when we dig them," put in Dick, and Dolly murmured his assent from behind the bone he was picking. "I helped make the pies with my pumpkin," called out Robbie, with a laugh which he stopped by retiring into his mug. "I picked some of the apples that the cider is made of," said Demi. "I raked the cranberries for the sauce," cried Nat. "I got the nuts," added Dan, and so it went on all round the table. "Who made up Thanksgiving?" asked Rob, for, being lately promoted to jacket and trousers, he felt a new and manly interest in the institutions of his country. "See who can answer that question," and Mr. Bhaer nodded to one or two of his best history boys. "I know," said Demi. "The Pilgrims made it." "What for?" asked Rob, without waiting to learn who the Pilgrims were. "I forget," and Demi subsided. "I believe it was because they were starved once, and so when they had a good harvest they said, 'We will thank God for it,' and they had a day and called it Thanksgiving," said Dan, who liked the story of the brave men who suffered so nobly for their faith. "Good! I didn't think you would remember anything but natural history," and Mr. Bhaer tapped gently on the table as applause for his pupil. Dan looked pleased, and Mrs. Jo said to her son, "Now do you understand about it, Robbie?" "No, I don't. I thought pilgrims were a sort of big bird that lived on rocks, and I saw pictures of them in Demi's book." "He means penguins. Oh, isn't he a little goosey?" And Demi laid back in his chair and laughed aloud. "Don't laugh at him, but tell him all about it if you can," said Mrs. Bhaer, consoling Rob with more cranberry sauce for the general smile that went round the table at his mistake. "Well, I will." And after a pause to collect his ideas, Demi delivered the following sketch of the Pilgrim Fathers, which would have made even those grave gentlemen smile if they could have heard it. "You see, Rob, some of the people in England didn't like the king or something, so they got into ships and sailed away to this country. It was all full of Indians and bears and wild creatures, and they lived in forts and had a dreadful time." "The bears?" asked Robbie with interest. "No, the Pilgrims, because the Indians troubled them. They hadn't enough to eat, and they went to church with guns, and ever so many died, and they got out of the ships on a rock, and it's called Plymouth Rock, and Aunt Jo saw it and touched it. The Pilgrims killed all the Indians and got rich, and hung the witches, and were very good, and some of the greatest great grandpas came in the ships. One was the Mayflower, and they made Thanksgiving, and we have it always, and I like it. Some more turkey, please?" "I think Demi will be an historian. There is such order and clearness in his account of events," and Uncle Fritz's eyes laughed at Aunt Jo as he helped the descendant of the Pilgrims to his third bit of turkey. "I thought you must eat as much as ever you could on Thanksgiving, but Franz says you mustn't even then," and Stuffy looked as if he had received bad news. "Franz is right, so mind your knife and fork and be moderate, or else you won't be able to help in the surprise by and by," said Mrs. Jo. "I'll be careful, but everybody does eat lots, and I like it better than being moderate," said Stuffy, who leaned to the popular belief that Thanksgiving must be kept by coming as near apoplexy as possible, and escaping with merely a fit of indigestion or a headache. "Now, my Pilgrims, amuse yourselves quietly till tea time. You will have enough excitement this evening," said Mrs. Jo as they rose from the table after a protracted sitting, finished by drinking every one's health in cider. "I think I will take the whole flock for a drive. It is so pleasant. Then you can rest, my dear, or you will be worn out this evening," added Mr. Bhaer; and as soon as coats and hats could be put on, the great omnibus was packed full, and away they went for a long gay drive, leaving Mrs. Jo to rest and finish sundry small affairs in peace. An early and light tea was followed by more brushing of hair and washing of hands. Then the flock waited impatiently for the company to come. Only the family was expected, for these small revels were strictly domestic, and, such being the case, sorrow was not allowed to sadden the present festival. All came, Mr. and Mrs. March, with Aunt Meg, so sweet and lovely, in spite of her black dress and the little widow's cap that encircled her tranquil face; Uncle Teddy and Aunt Amy with the Princess, looking more fairy-like than ever, in a sky blue gown, and a great bouquet of hothouse flowers, which she divided among the boys, sticking one in each buttonhole, making them feel peculiarly elegant and festive. One strange face appeared, and Uncle Teddy led the unknown gentleman up to the Bhaers, saying, "This is Mr. Hyde. He has been inquiring about Dan, and I ventured to bring him to night that he might see how much the boy has improved." The Bhaers received him cordially, for Dan's sake, pleased that the lad had been remembered; but after a few minutes' chat they were glad to know Mr. Hyde for his own sake. So genial, simple, and interesting was he. It was pleasant to see the boy's face light up when he caught sight of his friend; pleasanter still to see Mr. Hyde's surprise and satisfaction in Dan's improved manners and appearance; and pleasantest of all to watch the two sit talking in a corner, forgetting the differences of age, culture, and position, in the one subject which interested both, as man and boy compared notes and told the story of their summer life. "The performance must begin soon, or the actors will go to sleep," said Mrs. Jo when the first greetings were over. So every one went into the schoolroom and took seats before a curtain made of two bed covers. The children had already vanished, but stifled laughter and funny little exclamations from behind the curtain betrayed their whereabouts. The entertainment began with a spirited exhibition of gymnastics, led by Franz. The 6 elder lads, in blue trousers and red shirts, made a fine display of muscle with dumb bells, clubs, and weights, keeping time to the music of the piano played by Mrs. Jo behind the scenes. Dan was so energetic in this exercise that there was some danger of his knocking down his neighbors, like so many ninepins, or sending his bean bags whizzing among the audience, for he was excited by Mr. Hyde's presence and a burning desire to do honor to his teachers. "A fine, strong lad. If I go on my trip to South America in a year or two, I shall be tempted to ask you to lend him to me, Mr. Bhaer," said Mr. Hyde, whose interest in Dan was much increased by the report he had just heard of him. "You shall have him, and welcome, though we shall miss our young Hercules very much. It would do him a world of good, and I'm sure he would serve his friend faithfully." Dan heard both question and answer, and his heart leaped with joy at the thought of travelling in a new country with Mr. Hyde, and swelled with gratitude for the kindly commendation which rewarded his efforts to be all these friends desired to see him. After the gymnastics, Demi and Tommy spoke the old school dialogue, "Money makes the mare go." Demi did very well, but Tommy was capital as the old farmer, for he imitated Silas in a way that convulsed the audience and caused Silas himself to laugh so hard that Asia had to slap him on the back as they stood in the hall enjoying the fun immensely. Then Emil, who had got his breath by this time, gave them a sea song in costume, with a great deal about stormy winds, lee shores, and a rousing chorus of "Luff, boys, luff," which made the room ring, after which Ned performed a funny Chinese dance, and hopped about like a large frog in a pagoda hat. As this was the only public exhibition ever held at Plumfield, a few exercises in lightning arithmetic, spelling, and reading were given. Jack quite amazed the public by his rapid calculations on the blackboard. Tommy won in the spelling match, and Demi read a little French fable so well that Uncle Teddy was charmed. "Where are the other children?" asked every one as the curtain fell, and none of the little ones appeared. "Oh, that is the surprise. It's so lovely I pity you because you don't know it," said Demi, who had gone to get his mother's kiss, and stayed by her to explain the mystery when it should be revealed. Goldilocks had been carried off by Aunt Jo, to the great amazement of her papa, who quite outdid Mr. Bhaer in acting wonder, suspense, and wild impatience to know what was going to happen. At last, after much rustling, hammering, and very audible directions from the stage manager, the curtain rose to soft music, and Bess was discovered sitting on a stool beside a brown paper fireplace. A dearer little Cinderella was never seen, for the gray gown was very ragged, the tiny shoes all worn, the face so pretty under the bright hair, and the attitude so dejected. It brought tears, as well as smiles, to the fond eyes looking at the baby actress. She sat quite still, till a voice whispered, "Now!" Then she sighed a funny little sigh and said, "Oh, I wish I could go to the ball," so naturally that her father clapped frantically, and her mother called out, "Little darling!" These highly improper expressions of feeling caused Cinderella to forget herself and shake her head at them, saying reprovingly, "You mustn't peek to me." Silence instantly prevailed, and 3 taps were heard on the wall. Cinderella looked alarmed, but before she could remember to say, "What is dat?" The back of the brown paper fireplace opened like a door, and with some difficulty the Fairy Godmother got herself and her pointed hat through. It was Nan, in a red cloak, a cap, and a wand, which she waved as she said decidedly, "You shall go to the ball, my dear." "Now you must pull and show my pretty dress," returned Cinderella, tugging at her brown gown. "No, no, you must say, 'How can I go in my rags?'" said the Godmother in her own voice. "Oh yes, so I must," and the Princess said it, quite undisturbed by her forgetfulness. "I change your rags into a splendid dress because you are good," said the Godmother in her stage tones, and deliberately unbuttoning the brown pinafore, she displayed a gorgeous sight. The little Princess really was pretty enough to turn the heads of any number of small princes, for her mamma had dressed her like a tiny Court lady, in a rosy silk train, with satin underskirt, and bits of bouquets here and there, quite lovely to behold. The Godmother put a crown with pink and white feathers drooping from it on her head, and gave her a pair of silver paper slippers, which she put on, and then stood up, lifting her skirts to show them to the audience, saying with pride, "My glass ones! Ain't they pitty?" She was so charmed with them that she was with difficulty recalled to her part and made to say, "But I have no toach, Godmother." "Behold it!" and Nan waved her wand with such a flourish that she nearly knocked off the crown of the Princess. Then appeared the grand triumph of the piece. First a rope was seen to flap on the floor, to tighten with a twitch, as Emil's voice was heard to say, "Heave ahoy!" and Silas's gruff one to reply, "Stiddy, now stiddy!" A shout of laughter followed, for 4 large grey rats appeared, rather shaky as to their legs and queer as to their tails, but quite fine about the head, where black beads shone in the most lifelike manner. They drew, or were intended to appear as if they did, a magnificent coach, made of half the mammoth pumpkin, mounted on the wheels of Teddy's wagon, painted yellow to match the gay carriage. Perched on a seat in front sat a jolly little coachman in a white cotton wool wig, cocked hat, scarlet breeches, and laced coat, who cracked a long whip and jerked the red reins so energetically that the grey steeds reared finely. It was Teddy, and he beamed upon the company so affably that they gave him a round all to himself, and Uncle Laurie said, "If I could find as sober a coachman as that one, I would engage him on the spot." The coach stopped, the Godmother lifted in the Princess, and she was trundled away in state, kissing her hand to the public, with her glass shoes sticking up in front, and her pink train sweeping the ground behind. For, elegant as the coach was, I regret to say that Her Highness was rather a tight fit. The next scene was the ball, and here Nan and Daisy appeared as gay as peacocks in all sorts of finery. Nan was especially good as the proud sister, and crushed many imaginary ladies as she swept about the palace hall. The Prince, in solitary state upon a somewhat unsteady throne, sat gazing about him from under an imposing crown, as he played with his sword and admired the rosettes in his shoes. When Cinderella came in he jumped up and exclaimed, with more warmth than elegance, "My gracious, who is that?" and immediately led the lady out to dance, while the sisters scowled and turned up their noses in the corner. The stately jig executed by the little couple was very pretty, for the childish faces were so earnest, the costumes so gay, and the steps so peculiar, that they looked like the dainty quaint figures painted on a Watteau fan. The Princess's train was very much in her way, and the sword of Prince Rob nearly tripped him up several times. But they overcame these obstacles remarkably well, and finished the dance with much grace and spirit, considering that neither knew what the other was about. "Drop your shoe," whispered Mrs. Joe's voice as the lady was about to sit down. "Oh, I fordot!" And taking off one of the silvery slippers, Cinderella planted it carefully in the middle of the stage, said to Rob, "Now you must try and catch me," and ran away, while the Prince, picking up the shoe, obediently trotted after her. The third scene, as everybody knows, is where the herald comes to try on the shoe. Teddy, still in coachman's dress, came in blowing a tin fish horn melodiously, and the proud sisters each tried to put on the slipper. Nan insisted on playing cut off her toe with a carving knife, and performed that operation so well that the herald was alarmed, and begged her to be "willy keerful." Cinderella then was called, and came in with the pinafore half on, slipped her foot into the slipper, and announced with satisfaction, "I am the Princess." Daisy wept and begged pardon, but Nan, who liked tragedy, improved upon the story, and fell in a fainting fit upon the floor, where she remained comfortably enjoying the rest of the play. It was not long, for the Prince ran in, dropped upon his knees, and kissed the hand of Goldilocks with great ardour, while the herald blew a blast that nearly deafened the audience. The curtain had no chance to fall, for the Princess ran off the stage to her father crying, "Didn't I do well?" while the Prince and herald had a fencing match with the tin horn and wooden sword. It was beautiful, said everyone, and when the raptures had a little subsided, Nat came out with his violin in his hand. "Hush, hush!" cried all the children, and silence followed, for something in the boy's bashful manner and appealing eyes made everyone listen kindly. The bears thought he would play some of the old airs he knew so well, but to their surprise they heard a new and lovely melody, so softly, sweetly played that they could hardly believe it could be Nat. It was one of those songs without words that touch the heart, and sing of all tender, home-like hopes and joys, soothing and cheering those who listened to its simple music. Aunt Meg leaned her head on Demi's shoulder, Grandmother wiped her eyes, and Mrs. Joe looked up at Mr. Lorry, saying in a choky whisper, "You composed that?" "I wanted your boy to do you honour, and thank you in his own way," answered Lorry, leaning down to answer her. When Nat made his bow and was about to go, he was called back by many hands, and had to play again. He did so with such a happy face that it was good to see him, for he did his best, and gave them the gay old tunes that set the feet to dancing and made quietude impossible. "Clear the floor!" cried Emil, and in a minute the chairs were pushed back, the older people put safely in corners, and the children gathered on the stage. "Show your manners!" called Emil, and the boys pranced up to the ladies old and young, with polite invitations to "tread the mazy," as dear Dick Swiveller has it. The small lads nearly came to blows for the Princess, but she chose Dick, like a kind little gentlewoman as she was, and let him lead her proudly to her place. Mrs. Joe was not allowed to decline, and Aunt Amy filled Dan with unspeakable delight by refusing Franz and taking him. Of course Nan and Tommy, Nat and Daisy paired off, while Uncle Teddy went and got Asia, who was longing to "jig it," and felt much elated by the honour done her. Silas and Mary Ann had a private dance in the hall, and for half an hour Plumfield was at its merriest. The party wound up with a grand promenade of all the young folks, headed by the pumpkin coach, with the Princess and driver inside, and the rats in a wildly frisky state. While the children enjoyed this final frolic, the elders sat in the parlor looking on as they talked together of the little people with the interest of parents and friends. "What are you thinking of all by yourself, with such a happy face, Sister Jo?" asked Laurie, sitting down beside her on the sofa. "My summer's work, Teddy, and amusing myself by imagining the future of my boys," she answered, smiling as she made room for him. "They are all to be poets, painters, and statesmen, famous soldiers, or at least merchant princes, I suppose." "No, I am not as aspiring as I once was, and I shall be satisfied if they are honest men. But I will confess that I do expect a little glory and a career for some of them. Demi is not a common child, and I think he will blossom into something good and great, in the best sense of the word. The others will do well, I hope, especially my last two boys, for after hearing Nat play to night, I really think he has genius." "Too soon to say. Talent he certainly has, and there is no doubt that the boy can soon earn his bread by the work he loves. Build him up for another year or so, and then I will take him off your hands and launch him properly." "That is such a pleasant prospect for poor Nat, who came to me 6 months ago so friendless and forlorn. Dan's future is already plain to me. Mr. Hyde will want him soon, and I mean to give him a brave and faithful little servant. Dan is one who can serve well if the wages are love and confidence, and he has the energy to carve out his own future in his own way. Yes, I am very happy over our success with these boys, one so weak and one so wild, both so much better now, and so full of promise." "What magic did you use, Jo?" "I only loved them, and let them see it. Fritz did the rest." "Dear soul, you look as if 'only loving' had been rather hard work sometimes," said Laurie, stroking her thin cheek with a look of more tender admiration than he had ever given her as a girl. "I'm a faded old woman, but I'm a very happy one, so don't pity me, Teddy," and she glanced about the room with eyes full of a sincere content. "Yes, your plan seems to work better and better every year," he said, with an emphatic nod of approval toward the cheery scene before him. "How can it fail to work well when I have so much help from you all?" answered Mrs. Jo, looking gratefully at her most generous patron. "It is the best joke of the family, this school of yours and its success. So unlike the future we planned for you, and yet so suited to you after all. It was a regular inspiration, Jo," said Laurie, dodging her thanks as usual. "Ah, but you laughed at it in the beginning, and still make all manner of fun of me and my inspirations. Didn't you predict that having girls with the boys would be a dead failure? Now see how well it works!" And she pointed to the happy group of lads and lassies, dancing, singing, and chattering together with every sign of kindly good fellowship. "I give in, and when my Goldilocks is old enough, I'll send her to you. Can I say more than that? I shall be so proud to have your little treasure trusted to me. But really, Teddy, the effect of these girls has been excellent. I know you will laugh at me, but I don't mind. I'm used to it. So I'll tell you that one of my favorite fancies is to look at my family as a small world, to watch the progress of my little men, and lately to see how well the influence of my little women works upon them. Daisy is the domestic element, and they all feel the charm of her quiet, womanly ways. Nan is the restless, energetic, strong-minded one. They admire her courage, and give her a fair chance to work out her will, seeing that she has sympathy as well as strength, and the power to do much in their small world. Your Bess is the lady, full of natural refinement, grace, and beauty. She polishes them unconsciously, and fills her place as any lovely woman may, using her gentle influence to lift and hold them above the coarse, rough things of life, and keep them gentlemen in the best sense of the fine old word. It is not always the ladies who do that best, Jo. It is sometimes the strong, brave woman who stirs up the boy and makes a man of him." And Laurie bowed to her with a significant laugh. "No, I think the graceful woman whom the boy you allude to married has done more for him than the wild Nan of his youth. Or, better still, the wise, motherly woman who watched over him as Daisy watches over Demi, did more to make him what he is." And Jo turned toward her mother, who sat a little apart with Meg, looking so full of the sweet dignity and beauty of old age that Laurie gave her a glance of filial respect and love as he replied in serious earnest: "All three did much for him, and I can understand how well these little girls will help your lads." "Not more than the lads help them. It is mutual, I assure you. Nat does much for Daisy with his music. Dan can manage Nan better than any of us, and Demi teaches your Goldilocks so easily and well that Fritz calls them Roger Ascham and Lady Jane Grey. Dear me, if men and women would only trust, understand, and help one another as my children do, what a capital place the world would be!" And Mrs. Jo's eyes grew absent, as if she was looking at a new and charming state of society in which people lived as happily and innocently as her flock at Plumfield. "You are doing your best to help on the good time, my dear. Continue to believe in it, to work for it, and to prove its possibility by the success of her small experiment," said Mr. March, pausing as he passed to say an encouraging word; for the good man never lost his faith in humanity, and still hoped to see peace, good will, and happiness reign upon the earth. "I am not so ambitious as that, Father. I only want to give these children a home in which they can be taught a few simple things which will help to make life less hard to them when they go out to fight their battles in the world. Honesty, courage, industry, faith in God, their fellow creatures, and themselves. That is all I try for." "That is everything. Give them these helps, then let them go to work out their life as men and women, and whatever their success or failure is, I think they will remember and bless your efforts, my good son and daughter." The professor had joined them, and as Mr. March spoke he gave a hand to each, and left them with a look that was a blessing. As Jo and her husband stood together for a moment talking quietly, and feeling that their summer work had been well done, if Father approved, Mr. Lorry slipped into the hall, said a word to the children, and all of a sudden the whole flock pranced into the room, joined hands, and danced about Father and Mother Bear, singing blithely: "Summer days are over, summer work is done. Harvests have been gathered gaily one by one. Now the feast is eaten, finished is the play. But one rite remains for our Thanksgiving Day. Best of all the harvest, in the dear God's sight, are the happy children in the home to night. And we come to offer thanks where thanks are due, with grateful hearts and voices, Father, Mother, unto you." With the last words the circle narrowed, till the good professor and his wife were taken prisoner by many arms, and half hidden by the bouquet of laughing young faces which surrounded them, proving that one plant had taken root and blossomed beautifully in all the little gardens. For love is a flower that grows in any soil, works its sweet miracles undaunted by autumn frost or winter snow, blooming fair and fragrant all the year, and blessing those who give and those who receive. End of Chapter 21. End of Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Recording by James O'Connor, Randolph, Massachusetts, December 2010.